Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Max at 90 event. So we are delighted that you are able to join us for an afternoon of talks exploring the life and work of Peter Maxwell Davies in what would have been Max's 90th birthday year. So our invited speakers, who we will introduce in due course, are eminent composers Robert Saxton and Alasdair Nicolson, and leading British music scholar Philip Rupprecht. So my name is Nick Jones, and together with Richard McGregor, we co-direct the Peter Maxwell Davies Research Network. And the aim of this network, which was established back 4 years ago in November 2020, is to unite international scholars with interests in the life and music of Max, to create a focus of all kinds of research, analysis, and interpretation centered on his life and music, and of course to raise awareness and increase interest and to promote collaboration between researchers throughout the UK and internationally. So you've already got a copy of our schedule for today. I will pop it into the chat when we start the proceedings proper. So we have asked our speakers to talk for around about 30 minutes in total, after which there will be time to open the floor to questions. So as you're listening, then please do jot down some questions for our speakers. And as you'll see in the schedule, there'll be several comfort breaks built into the afternoon where you can obviously just disappear for 10 minutes and grab yourself a cup of tea or a coffee or whatever. So without further ado, then, let me introduce our first speaker, Alasdair Nicolson. So Alasdair is one of Scotland's foremost composers who first came to public acclaim in the early 1990s, having won the prestigious IBM Composers Prize. His music is a rich mix of influences, frequently drawing on his upbringing off the west coast of Scotland on the Isle of Skye. As well as an international career as a composer, he is also a conductor and teacher, and highly regarded as a creative producer. He has followed in the footsteps of many eminent composers as artistic director of St Magnus International Festival in the Orkney Islands, and formerly at the Bath International Music Festival. His music is widely performed and broadcast, and it has won critical acclaim for its clarity, craftsmanship, and individuality. As well as his compositional work, he has also been involved in many, many different spheres of music. So today, Alasdair, you are very, very welcome, and you will be talking about working with Max. So I want to kick things off by asking you a question and asking you to reflect on something. So I want to ask you about the Young Composers course that you and Max ran in 1996. So I'm being very self-indulgent here because I was one of the young composers on that course, and I certainly had more hair then. So perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about your experience of working with Max on that project.
Yeah, I certainly can. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for that grandiose introduction, Nick. It's the Hoy course, for those that don't know, ran for several years, and Max always worked, as I think he did in Dartington, where Robert worked with him, worked with a younger composer as an assistant, as a sidekick, or whatever you'd like to say. And I think it was not long after I had won that competition you mentioned, actually, that Max phoned me up and said, "Oh, would you like to come and help me out this year and come to Hoy and see all that?" I'd been to Magnus Festival probably before that, but the Hoy course actually didn't happen at festival time. In the years that have passed since then, we have had courses which run at festival time, but the Hoy course didn't. It was kind of out on its own, always in collaboration with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. And Max would walk across the hill of a morning from Bunnertown across to the other side of Hoy, avoiding the skewers and the rest of it who might attack you as you came through that way. And it was a sort of mixture of a practical course and a sort of retreat, if you like, because the accommodation was in the youth hostel. I think, indeed, the year that you were there, Nick, and you're talking about, there was a young Mexican composer on that course who was finding it all far too cold and miserable, and indeed being stuck with lots of other composers in a very enclosed space, was struggling to write music and downing Coca-Cola and instant coffee. It was very sort of intense experience, but in terms of working with Max, Max was always, because I worked with him again in our courses to do with the festival, which was the sort of son off the Hoy courses, if you like. Max was always a funny sort of teacher in a way, in that he could either be very dogmatic about getting something absolutely right, and this was the only way to do it, and equally could be as loose and free and don't want to interfere as you like. And sometimes that could be quite disarming, both for young composers and for somebody working alongside him, because you might encounter the person that got quite angry about a piece of notation, followed by somebody who didn't really have much to say about something. But actually that worked quite well, because when you're working as a bit of a double act, I suppose, you can piece together the bits that need to be there for everyone, and also just work out that sometimes the teaching of composition particularly can be about correcting some obvious technical things, but also has to be a lot about encouragement and allowing people to do what they need to do and explore and find things out. The end of that course, of course, was an arrival of instrumentalists from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra who came in late in the day to play the results of people's musing over the course of 10 days, 2 weeks. And again, Max and I would take, one piece or other and either conduct them if they needed to be conducted, or take to do with them, etc. It was always a kind of interesting prospect, which is why we resurrected that Hoy course within the festival itself, and it moved into June, because I think coming to a very remote place, working with some composers and some musicians live, whilst in a rather special environment, does change the sort of dynamic of one's thinking, and the sense of being able to create and the energy behind it, I think, in honesty, very different from just studying composition week by week with a teacher.
Ooh, unmute myself. Thank you, Alasdair. Yes, we might come back to this idea of Max being kind of dogmatic, but at the same time being free for composers to explore. I just wonder if you could go back a little bit. I mean, how aware of you of Max's music when you were a student, when you were sort of growing up? I mean, I think you said you were at Dartington, and you studied with Max and Robert Saxton.
Indeed, long time ago. But actually, I didn't know much about Max other than probably as a sort of personality or a name that I might have come across until I got to university. I went to Edinburgh University, and then became very fascinated by Max's music, and made him the centerpiece of my mid-degree dissertation on his music theatre. And indeed, at the same time, first met Max. I think I did the young composer student thing of sort of writing to the person that was famous and whose work I was looking at, and tried to get to meet them, and indeed met Max for the very first time there, who was very sort of welcoming and enthusiastic and encouraging, and didn't hugely want to talk about his work necessarily, but was very interested in what I was doing as much as anything else. And I think that was probably around about the time of, somebody out there may correct me, Sinfonietta Academica, which
yes,
was a piece for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and it celebrated, I should know this as well because I was a student of the Reed Music School, but it celebrated some anniversary either of the university or the Reed Music School. Forgive me, I haven't got the details, and I remember I had met Max, and then he was around all of that happening, so I sort of got to know him a little better just because we'd met. And as I say, was fascinated really early on by, I guess, some of the work that established Max's career, which, was the music theatre, the Miss Donnithorne 8 songs, and some of the other works that are not so well known, maybe, from that sort of music theatre, theatrical period, where Piero seemed to be in the background of both the ensemble and the kind of thinking. And I just loved that. I went on in my early compositional career to work a lot in theatre, and I think maybe the sort of combination of extraordinary musical thought alongside very clever theatrical sort of approach to something really appealed to me. And all the extraordinary technical things that were happening, musically speaking, compositionally, in those pieces were highly exciting to somebody that was just sort of finding stuff. So I encountered him at that point, first of all, as a sort of, he was somebody I knew about, somebody who was rather famous and whose work I was interested in. But we quickly got to know one another, and I ended up, not long after university, still in Edinburgh, conducting for my sins. And I don't know why I ever said yes, Vesali Icones, another of the theatre pieces, in fact, for Edinburgh Contemporary Arts Trust, with William Conway playing the solo cello, young William Conway, me conducting, and an ensemble drawn together. So from kind of looking at the works, as it were, from an academic perspective, trying to write a dissertation about what Max was about, I ended up actually dealing with it in the driving seat. And boy, is that hard work. That's a tricky one, that, for cellist, for conductor, for ensemble, for everybody. And that, I remember performing in the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh, big concert with Tom Yang, the dancer, who was director of Basic Space Dance Theatre, doesn't exist anymore, one of the Scottish contemporary dance companies. And we drew the most enormous crowd for that performance. Even the ushers came back into the auditorium because they'd heard that the end result of this piece was that the dancer ended up stark naked, and that this was promised, as it were, as a marketing device for the thing. Indeed, Tom did get almost naked, etc. So even the stewards, I remember, at the Queen's Hall were very excited to come in. But I worked again with Max, working on that piece, which sort of took me not into the looking at it remotely, but took me right into the centre of it, having to deal with it as a musician. And that was very exciting, tricky, but very exciting. And of course, got to work with Will Conway, who both of us very young people, but we've worked together ever since. So that was another meeting at the time. Then Dartington, I suppose, must have come somewhere around about there as well, where I ended up working there as a student, young thing, as it were, sort of still bemused by the idea that I could call myself a composer. And Max was one of those people, I think, for me, that allowed me to feel that I was a composer, and it was possible to do many things, because what he did was many, not just writing music, but working with young people, working with children, working in terms of, at the time, he was director of Dartington. So the idea that, old-fashioned musician, you could be many things. And I tended to do an awful lot of things. And I thought, this sort of gave me permission, in a funny kind of way, to feel like I could be a composer musician, because the doing of many things and working in theatre, working with children, working, etc., were all parts of that job, not just writing notes on the page. And from that moment on, I suppose, I worked with Max over the years significantly, and frequently ended up being asked to work on his music, but deliver it to young people, be that as a composer chosen to work on the Strathclyde concertos, to working for the South Bank Centre on working with children to do with the Antarctic, Symphonia Antarctica, or is that the Vaughan Williams, whichever, and other pieces too. I was sort of tasked with knowing Max well enough and knowing his music well enough to sort of bridge the gap between both him when he came to visit these children, but also his music and what it meant. And that could sometimes be quite tricky because the music could be quite thorny for a class of primary school children. So, but Max was very good when he came out to deal with that kind of situation because, as we all know, he could be a chameleon into those sort of things. And whilst he would often say that he could happily see children far enough, I don't think I'm spilling any beans by saying that, he was actually very good with kids. He had a sort of rather brusque manner that suggested that he never wanted to see them, but actually when encountering them was fantastically inspirational and very engaged and communicative. So yeah, that's sorry, I went a bit further than right to the beginning, Nick, but that's where it sort of emerged from me. It was a study of the music theatre.
Thank you. I had no idea that you'd written a dissertation on his music theatre pieces. Out of interest, and I'm being nosy now, which ones did you focus on?
It was a bit of a survey of many, kind of tracking the idea of how that fitted into 8 songs, and Donathorn came at the centre of it, Revelation and Fall, and then other works around the edges of that, of which there are many. And by that stage, there were still some pieces to arrive, that were not yet written. So it was very specifically, I suppose, the earlier stuff, but also looking into the context of the emerging idea of this sort of concert hall, semi-staged music theatre, small-scale ensemble, perhaps with the protagonists within that setting with no scenery, etc. It was about looking at that post Piero, maybe. So yeah, it sits in a drawer somewhere.
I'd love to read it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they stay in that drawer.
Alasdair, I mentioned in my introduction that you were brought up on the Isle of Skye and the Black Isle. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the influence of landscape in your music, but also the conversations that perhaps you did have with Max about the similar role of landscape and seascape in his own pieces.
Yeah, well, I guess when the backdrop to your life, childhood, whatever you might say, is one of the significant landscapes of the world, as it were, and is in itself very beautiful and all the rest of it. To some extent, you can take that for granted, but equally, to some extent, it's a big part of what is very special to your gut, if you like. It's very visceral, that sort of just sense of mountain, sea, landscape, and history, that too. I think Max and I, the Orkney version of that is very similar to the Skye proposal. That they are both significant historically. They're significant as landscape. They feature for people as sort of bucket list places to visit, etc. And I think Max and I realized another thing and shared this very much and did talk about this, I know, which is a thing that most composers do like, which is peace, quiet, and isolation. And to some extent, if, as I did, you grew up in a place that provides that anyway, because it is remote and isolated, it's almost ideal for the creative mind. Max sort of chose to move to a landscape like that and put himself right on the edge of Hoy, far away from anything really. And I think, yes, he and I shared many sort of similar interests in that regard. And I think landscape and solitariness and a sense of being able to get away from everything, including noise, unless it was natural, was something we talked about a lot. I mean, Max famously walked out of restaurants because of the muzak playing, etc., etc. But I understand that completely, and it's that is something beyond the superficial that we talked about a lot, and just that sense that how you make things comes from sort of the blank space, the white space, the empty canvas, the blank page. And it's so much easier to engage with that if you're sort of surrounded by pure nature and not much else, actually. It feels very natural then, and dare I say, easy to sort of make things in a way. So I guess that was a source of much conversation. And you know, Max was sort of fascinated, as we know, by the other, be that via sort of religion or occult or, you know, from magic squares way beyond. And I think, you know, he was also fascinated by the instincts that come, which I talk about a lot more these days, the instincts that come from being brought up somewhere that isn't urban, that has a lot to do with land, animals, weather, etc., and that causes you to have sensations that perhaps are, you know, part of the old ways, if you like, people might say, or whatever. The sense that, you know, your senses are heightened somehow because of where you are and what you experience or don't experience round about you to some extent. Therefore, your instincts and your gut and everything become much more important, and you can trust them a lot more, I guess.
Mm. We've spoken so far about the 1990s and the 1980s. Let's move on into the noughties and beyond now. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about, or a lot about, your work as artistic director of the St Magnus International Festival and being the director of the St Magnus Composers Course.
I certainly can. I had, I think, probably my first commission for professional work was for the St Magnus Festival. This is where I actually, and that dates back to the early 90s or late 80s maybe even. And my connection to the festival goes from there right to now. And I'm sitting in Orkney, having just come from the office this morning. Therefore, I sort of, once they'd hooked me in, I kind of never stopped being here for some reason, be it doing education work, conducting something, or writing music or whatever. And a long way into that sort of interaction with the festival, a conductor's course was started by Martin Brabant. And that was very exciting and a lovely addition to what went on here. But I remember at the time saying to Glenys, who was the then director of the festival, but what about composers, you know, and what about the legacy, as it were, of that the course that used to happen on Hoy? So Glenys, being the person she is, listened to what I was saying and said, right, let's start one of those, and said, would you lead on that? And I said, very, very happily lead on it, because it's something I'm really passionate about, is helping. Teaching is a big word, but helping younger composers along and just making space and allowing and giving the odd bit of wisdom if you can. So we started a parallel course to the conductor's course, and we indeed interacted with the conductor's course. So composers were paired up with conductors to conduct their work. And it was really a quite intense, even more so than Hoy, because the composers ensemble was there all the time. We as teachers were there all the time. And Max didn't work every day of it, but he dipped into that, both as invited and as the sessions seemed to be useful for him to do that. Sally Beamish and I were the sort of drones that got on with it, and Max came in and put the gold leaf on. And we worked across, 2 weeks, giving people daily playback, which wasn't even what we did in Hoy, one-to-one sessions. And because it was around the festival time, we also had visiting performers coming and going. So, for example, James Crabb came in to play a recital on the accordion. He did a workshop on writing for the accordion. So it was real gold standard course. I'm talking in the past at the moment only because we've had to put them slightly on ice in the COVID years, and we're just working on bringing them back into into the picture at the moment. So forgive the sort of historical sense to it. It's just because they haven't operated for a couple of years. But that's what happened. And Max came in, and those were classic examples, actually, of what I described in the Hoy course, which were Max coming in and everyone very excited that Max was coming. And sometimes he wouldn't say anything at all about somebody's work. And sometimes he would say an awful lot. And you know, sometimes to the frustration of students, I could tell, because they were rather hoping that, you know, Max would opine on their work and either praise or give some feedback. And sometimes he didn't want to say anything at all. Even I can remember having a look on occasion when I sort of handed over to him as if to say, I don't really want to, thank you. But, you know, we checked along, and he was, you know, he was very good at finding things within to say about things, and also just forensically find points to make that were relevant to anyone that wants to be a professional and wants to work. You know, practical stuff that will be important if you're going to be a composer. That's the course. That was the course. It will be the course again. And I think it was a significant starting point for a lot of composers. I mean, I look around now and see conductors and composers at the proms and beyond everywhere else, and I have seen just about every one of them come through our courses here. Not that we're responsible for their careers, but I see, you know, that we did have quite a talented bunch of people come through here, partly because they wanted to come and meet Max, partly because they wanted to come to Orkney, and the famous thing that is St Magnus International Festival. And you know, that brings me on to the festival, which hits 50th anniversary next year. 2020, sorry, not next year. I'm in festival preparation mode, so 25 is now next year. The one after, 2026. And I'm lucky enough to look after it now, having taken over from Glenys, who took over from Max, really. And it's a great privilege. It's great fun. Having the option to do what a lot of musicians do in their pub conversations, etc., which is, wouldn't it be great to do that project? Wouldn't it be great if you could get those people together and make them play, etc.? I'm in a position where I can at least have a go at making that happen sometimes, or try. So it's a great privilege. And of course, you know, I have the legacy of Max and all the work that he did. I have an international sense that this is a very important festival, very significant one in the international circuit. We're one of 3 festivals in Scotland that are funded by government money, Edinburgh Festival and Celtic Connections being the other 2. So we sit significantly there. You know, what I said about when you talked about landscape, Orkney is a fantastically rich place to be able to do anything artistic, never mind being creative, which I was talking about earlier, but to be creative in terms of dreaming up ideas and festivals and events. You know, when you've got the history that ranges from, well, way back 5,000-6,000 years BC, etc. You've got Neolithic sites that are World Heritage sites. When you've got medieval cathedral, you've got all the stories of Magnus and Vikings. You have John Ray, who went to be part of the Hudson Bay Company, where lots of Stromness men went off to find the Northwest Passage, etc., etc., right up to World War I and II here, and now the Centre for Wave and Wind Energy, etc. Orkney is one of those odd places that sort of across history is the centre of stuff. It's significant, and for such a small place off the top of Scotland, it seems unlikely. But it's there, and that is such a fantastic thing to work with. And as I say, you know, Max must have realised that as well. It just is such an alive place. Clearly was an alive place because people stopped here and put stone circles up and built edifices, etc. It always has been. So, you know, my time here has been a great joy, and working while Max was still alive. We hit 40 just in the year that he died. And working with him around was always rather good, because he kept out of the way, which I thought was very honourable, but was helpful when when I needed, and it was useful. And he was eventually the president, and he would say to me each year, "What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?" I said, "Just be presidential. That's all I need, thank you." Which, of course, Max was very good at, and very good at dealing with people, etc. He had stepped back from programming and things a long time before I came along. So apart from the odd suggestion or somebody he'd met at a dinner party or in London or something as a potential useful contact, or somebody that was very interested in coming that one might imagine would be far too expensive or you couldn't get, he sort of stood back and allowed, which again I was pleased about, because sometimes in these circumstances the weight when you take over things and there's a very significant name attached to it, I'm sure the same is true in Aldborough, it can be quite intimidating, plus it can feel restricting in a way, and actually I never felt that with Max at all. He was always very supportive and energetic in his support, and warm with that, and as I say, helped when he needed to but didn't interfere, which is very honourable and admirable, I would say.
No, not yet.
Thank you, Alasdair. We've gone for half an hour, so I suspect that we need to open the floor to any questions. I've got a couple of questions here. I've got up my sleeve, but I'm guessing that our conversation might have provoked some kind of question. So I'm just looking around the Zoom room. You can either put your hand up like that, or virtually. It's completely up to you. Has anyone got a question for Alasdair? Okay, I'll ask my question then. I just want to pick up on something which you said right at the start, which I said I'd come back to, and this kind of dichotomy, I suppose, between Max looking at young composers' pieces and either taking a kind of a dogmatic, pedantic, whatever you want to call it, approach, and a more free. I'm just going to speak from a personal point of view now, because I can remember in the 1996 Hoy Young Composers course, we all had an individual sessions with yourself and Max, and one of the things that I do remember, I was expecting him to talk about structure, the piece, because we had to write the pieces as we were on the course. So I must admit I didn't do that much preparatory work. I had some idea in my mind what was going to happen, but I did all the composing in that first week. And I can remember going to him and talking about structure, and he said, there's one thing I would change in your piece. And he said, there's a cello line here, and it was a C, the C below middle C. He said, all you need to do is just take it down the octave. So we have the cello open string at the bottom. And I thought, yes, it will. That will work so well. And that's all I can remember. I'm sure he said other things, but he did have this ability just to get to the nub of the problem, the issue, or whatever. And so I'm guessing Alasdair Stout, who was also on that course as well. I don't know if you had a similar experience with Max when you had your one-to-one. I'm not sure what you spoke about, but yeah, I mean, go back to Alasdair Nicolson. Sorry, there's too many Alastairs and spelt differently here. But I wonder if you could just say something about that from your experience, not necessarily on that course, but on the other courses that you've worked with Max on. The difference in approach, I suppose.
Well, Max had a very good ear and a very good sense of orchestration and a very good sense of all that kind of thing. And I can remember, I think, Robert, you were probably there with a string quartet, which would have been, can't remember, and a Brahms...
Brodskis.
The Brodskis, that's right. And Brahms had been set to be arranged, which was quite... And it's a thing that I have never done and have thought of doing since on composers and courses of this ilk. But Max had decided to make people arrange something for the quartet, but for other music, as it were. So it was Brahms, intermezzo or something, and it was a sort of calculated device to get people to work with the sound of the string quartet, not having to worry about the music, because you weren't writing that, you were simply and I thought that was quite an interesting way of working and teaching, and it talks into what you were saying, Nick, about finding that the right place to put the note or whatever. That I think Max had a good way of peeling apart the sort of constituent parts for a composer, be that the orchestration, the form of, or the shape, the architecture of something as well, and seeing them as all as sort of maybe technical things that you could look at, and where possible to do some teaching on, if you like, because of course we can all argue that you can't teach composition, but there are areas you can go into and here. And I think that exercise I'm reminded of just simply because it was a real exercise. It was saying, right, let's just work with the string quartet. And I can remember somebody very clumsily, it wasn't me, and I can't remember who they were, so I'm not going to slander anybody, but somebody doing a very ham-fisted job on the opening, on one of those Brahms piano pieces. And Max, just in front of their eyes, fixed it. A bit like you're saying, Nick, with moving something down, simply as down an octave. And I remember what it was. It was simply about overlapping the parts so that they did dovetail, as opposed to being left hanging and each note and each instrument followed one another. They were living as dovetails. And the difference in sound, the difference in reality compared with the piano version, etc., was just sort of extraordinary. And it was the tiniest tweak. But Max sort of heard it immediately and did it as well, which I thought, was another good teaching method in a funny kind of way, which is not just to say, I think there's something wrong here, but actually to fix it and show somebody. And that sort of speaks to what you're saying about, homing in on one little thing and probably transforming quite a lot by fixing that little moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and he certainly did. And I seem to remember what young composers we had to compose a piece, of course, but we also had to arrange a folk song from our own
right
country. Yeah, I seem to remember. So that was very interesting exercise, and I got it completely wrong. I can remember that. It wasn't very good. That's why I'm not a composer now. So let's move on. No, I think what you were saying there about Max is a different approach to teaching composition. Of course, when I used to speak to him, he kept going back to the 1950s when he was a student of Petrassi in Rome, and the fantastic tutelage he had from Petrassi there, and he had to justify every single note. So yeah, that kind of feeds into that. But this idea of allowing the composer to be free at the same time is something quite special as well, I think.
I think what you've hit on in the picture. I remember Max talking to me about the way Petrassi worked, and it's something that I've not quite stolen, but sort of developed in terms of teaching as well. Which is, I think that, and Max clearly had experienced this, and I think he worked like this. Was that if you are passing on any skills, you're trying to. Clearly what Petrassi was doing with Max was asking lots of questions. And I guess that's about training somebody to ask the questions themselves when they're composing. In other words, it's sort of like showing somebody the best way to practice if you were an instrumentalist, etc. You're not going to do that forever, but you're just trying to sort of put that as an idea into somebody's head. And I think that was something Max wanted to do, was to ask some questions or to query things not from the perspective of higher ground, more training somebody to be able to do that without another human around. You do it in your own composing shed, at your own composing desk. You sort of learn to ask those questions, to make the decisions, etc., to work out how to make those decisions. And that you're not always there to correct or to offer the better solution or the supposedly, expert solution. You're more there to show somebody that you might need to think about something or ask a question about something, or even more often than not, for all of us that are creative, is sort of ask the question, why have I done that? And sometimes you can live on your gut, but sometimes you do need to explain yourself.
Yeah. One thing we haven't touched upon yet, and it might come up in talks later on, or some of the roundtable discussion, is Max the conductor. I mean, to what extent did you talk to Max about conducting? Because, I think it's relatively well known that he didn't particularly like conducting. So could you say a little bit about that?
I mean, I didn't talk a great deal with Max about conducting, other than him telling me what he was doing next, or where he'd been, etc. I've heard from him. Yes, he didn't absolutely love conducting, I think, but equally, it's a strange one, because I don't think he liked the technical, physical thing of conducting, but I do think he liked to be in there with musicians working and being practical. I mean, don't forget, he was back in the days of the fires, etc. He was conducting. It wasn't. There's a sort of perception that Max started conducting, partly because I guess he started conducting repertoire and Mozart operas at Glyndebourne, etc. But in a way, he'd always conducted, and I think he really did. He knew what he was doing, and I think he liked to be in the midst of all those musicians and worked very well in those circumstances. I think the sort of technical art of conducting, and then perhaps when it's on repertoire and you're in an opera pit or something like that, there is a technical art to that. There's experience you need to do that. And I think Max may have realized that, it wasn't his favorite thing, nor the thing he'd done all his life, but he did like to be in there amongst musicians. And indeed, liked to be able to. He was a great one for looking at older music and Haydn string quartets or Mozart symphonies or whatever, and Beethoven. He did like to be in amongst the music, sort of performing it as he might see it as a composer. And that's the one opportunity you have, I suppose, is to be a conductor in the concert repertoire, is to go in and get your hands on it and fashion it as you think it should sound. And I think he enjoyed that bit of it. Technically, I don't think so, but the rest of it, I think that's where his motivation came from to some extent.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the way that the study of those pieces fed into his own work, whether that's the symphonies, string quartets, etc., etc. And perhaps Phil can talk a little bit about how the conducting feeds into some of the cycles that he wrote as well, and how that affected those. But you're absolutely correct. For Max, it seems that conducting, I mean, he certainly didn't have any conducting lessons that he could look back on and reflect on with fondness, let's put it that way. And I mean, he learned so much from being a school teacher at Cirencester as well, and the conducting which he had to do there with the school children, with the choir and the orchestra, all that kind of fed into Max the composer ultimately. Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes. I'm just going to open the floor again. Richard, have you got a question for Alasdair?
Well, not so much a question as a comment. This thing about the conducting, he had some not very nice experiences, particularly around dealing with brass players in his early sort of late 50s and into the 60s, and I think that always stayed with him as a kind of difficulty he was always wondering what was going to. I think might have been wondering what was going to come up, in the process of putting the piece together. And he also experienced, as you know, some very negative players sort of dealing with his work. And Alasdair, did you see any of this negativity towards performers? How did it affect him?
I didn't see that much negativity, actually. Although I sort of heard about it, and also heard from some players around the edges what they might have thought, etc. So I didn't see it happen directly, and my experience of any of that was more sort of around the edges. Never saw it in person, but I mean, I think as a composer and to some extent a conductor, you're always the teacher in the class that's going to get that's on edge because they're not quite sure what this class is going to do, and they're a rather unruly bunch of people potentially. Either they're not going to like their music or they're not going to like your upbeat, and that's sort of the job to some extent, isn't it? And you have to get used to it, but I don't think any of us ever does, however much you have the experience that Max did, or any of us as we get older have. I think still it's first day at school in terms of I'm not quite sure what crowd I am going to have to try and control today or convince if you're a composer,
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well,
got a question. You've got a question from Alasdair.
Just perhaps a comment again about that 1996 composition course, which was, a mind-opening experience for me. It was a wonderful, time in Orkney. But I also remember, besides the piece we were writing and besides the arrangement of the folk song, Max also asked us to come with two pieces prepared or at least looked at, which was the Ligeti 10 pieces for wind quintet and also the late Beethoven Opus 130 string quartet. And I remember, the composers were very enthusiastic about the Ligeti, but I think the Beethoven was profoundly above our pay grade at that point, and we didn't really know, what to say. And I could see as the week went on, Max getting more and more frustrated that, we were raving about the Ligeti and perhaps less about the Beethoven. But it was wonderful to see how in those one-to-one sessions, he would link what you were doing, at that point of your time as a composer into those two pieces. And again, just linking those pieces of the past, into what was relevant for a young composer was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And I also just remember, Alasdair, you conducting all our pieces, and seeing from your back, just seeing what was going on with you and the musicians trying to put our pieces together was, again, a very rewarding, experience. So.
Well, thank you. I had remembered Max and I sharing that job, but clearly not. So,
well, thank you. I thought that was a fantastic way to start the session this afternoon. We were exactly on time at 1:50, so we will have a comfort break now for 10 minutes, and then we'll see you back at 2:00. Please just put your cameras. And we'll see you back at 2:00, and Phil Rupprecht will be talking to us. So see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. So our next speaker is Phil Rupprecht, and I did have here we go. my pieces of paper are all mixed up, but I have got it now. So Phil Rupprecht specializes in music of the 20th and 21st centuries. His recent writings address the institutional politics of musical taste, concepts of narrative in operatic drama, the role of the stereotype in the formation of national traditions in music, and agency effects in instrumental music. His research at the BBC Written Archives has led recently to a study of the production of middlebrow taste in Britain in the 1950s. His book, which is the highly recommended, his monumental study of British musical modernism, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. And most recently, he has published essays on contemporary composers such as Thomas Adès, Simon Holt, and James Dillon. And Phil is also co-editor with David Beard of the book series Music Since 1900, published by Cambridge University Press. So you are very, very welcome, Phil. And I know that Richard will be chairing this paper, but I think, Phil, over to you.
Okay, well, can everyone hear me okay if the microphone's good? First of all, just quick, very warm thanks to Nick and Richard for the invitation to join this, and it's so amazing to be have a chance to be hearing from people who knew Max well and friends, and so it's very special. I've got a talk that I just wrote, and there are a few slides. So, I'm over here in North Carolina, zooming in. There are not many slides, but I'm going to, now that I've learned to do it, share my screen. And this will allow us to hear a few little clips. I'm sorry there won't be time for more than that, but just when we get to that. So let's see if I can do this. Should be slides. Go to the full screen mode. I should go to my title slide. It'll be more exciting. There we go. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So unless Richard wants to say anything else, but I mean, we can get going.
No, please do. Please.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So, as I mentioned, Nick and Richard invited me for this wonderful celebration, and said, "Well, what do you want to talk about?" And it didn't. This idea just popped into my head, really. That, well, I want to talk about musical genre, and in relation to Max, and the idea just sprung up. It's a big topic, probably too big, and I just thought, well, how would I do that? And I thought, well, the Strathclyde cycle of concertos and the Naxos cycle. Hey, it's only 20 pieces. Why not do that? So, so this talk kind of attempts to say something about that. It's very much preliminary work in progress, but anyway, hopefully we can see what that leads to. So musical genre and Peter Maxwell Davies, the concerto and quartet cycles. Approaching Peter Maxwell Davies's vast oeuvre, we encounter a composer who worked in all imaginable genres, from solo piano miniatures through orchestral symphonies, operas, and ballet scores. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at this range. All kinds of music, knowing a composer whose career spanned 6 decades. But a glance at the definitive 2020 works list by Nicholas Jones and Richard McGregor also prompts questions of genre. Perusing those 338 numbered opuses and 200 unnumbered items, a career narrative might begin to form. A period of juvenilia centers on piano works Max himself performed. A first professional phase in the 50s brought virtuosic avant-garde items for chamber forces and one orchestral graduation piece, Prolation. The years at Cirencester teaching, 1959-62, led to works for young performers and for professionals, the string quartet and the cantata Leopardi fragments. The 60s continued with ensemble or music theatre scores written after 1967 specifically for the Pierrot players. Only a handful of larger pieces, notably the 2 orchestral fantasias, precede the first opera Taverner, completed by 1970. After moving to Orkney, Max made many settings of George Mackay Brown's words and wrote 2 chamber operas, The Martyrdom of St. Magnus and The Lighthouse, that's in the 70s. So Max's symphony First Symphony, completed in 1976 at the age of 42, suddenly raised questions of genre. Quote, in the mid-70s, the critic Paul Griffiths wrote in 1982, it still seemed very odd that an advanced composer should take up the most orthodox of musical forms, end quote. Griffiths' point reflects the ties of symphonic thought to key tonality. Hans Keller, for one, had argued that a large-scale integration of contrasts faltered in a post-tonal setting. The connotations and expectations for a symphony, as Kenneth Gloag observed in a 2008 analysis of that First Symphony, were tied to a prior history of the genre. Max himself saw no problem in tackling the symphony and proceeded to write numbers 2, 3, and 4 over the next decade and 6 more later on. What concerns us today is his embrace of 2 other traditional genres, the concerto and the string quartet. Brahms famously waited until his 40s to publish string quartets or a First Symphony, wary of Beethoven's shadow. Was this also Davies's attitude to tradition? Parsed for genre, we see in Max's catalogue that those most orthodox genres, Griffith's phrase, arrive late. The 10 Strathclyde concertos of 1987 to 96 were preceded by only a Sinfonia Concertante of 1982 and the 1985 Violin Concerto. No concertos before that. The 10 Naxos quartets, composed 2002 to 2007, likewise lack major precursors. There is the 1961 string quartet, but other than that, nothing really in Max's catalogue. Beyond the belatedness of Max's turn to these genres, the real surprise is also one of profligacy. Suddenly, a whole cycle of 10 concertos for Strathclyde, plus satellites, trumpet, piccolo, piano, and horn, all written in the 80s and 90s. Not one string quartet, but a major cycle, composed within only 6 years. My impression is that neither cycle has yet received the attention these extraordinary works deserve, despite the availability of fine recordings and warm concert audience reactions. What then is the problem? The reasons may be complicated, but they have to do, I will argue, with the workings of genre as a sorting mechanism. To see how audiences and critics have understood these pieces, we cannot but speak of genre, and in doing so, we can acknowledge that genre is itself a pretty slippery concept, bound up with another moving target, that of reception. The Strathclyde cycle, according to Max's early biographer Mike Seabrook, was Max's own idea. Let me just do the slide. Okay, yeah. The obvious prompt was a new institutional affiliation, Max's 1985 appointment as Associate Composer-Conductor of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. Conducting classical repertory, Haydn to Schubert, alongside his own works, he soon wrote a concerto for Robin Miller, the SCO's principal oboist, then proposed a whole cycle to the MD Ian Ritchie. With regional and national grants, a decades-long funding alliance was born. Like Stockhausen or Britten in the LP era, Max was in a position suddenly to record new pieces as they appeared. Many CDs appeared after 1990 on Collins and after 2003 on the Naxos Records labels. I put this slide up. The Strathclyde's links to educational outreach in Scotland were widely publicized. And this is just one of the articles maybe that reflects that, but this article actually describes some of the work. Each new concerto, besides the premiere and a recording, toured schools in specific regions, introduced by a soloist and a guest composer. And I gather that Alasdair was one of those composers. So maybe we'll hear more about that. So far, so good. Writing in 1994, however, Seabrook reported, quote, a strong groundswell of feeling that Max is becoming conservative musically, less adventurous, more accessible, more tonal, more tuneful, not the angry young man of the 60s and early 70s. And he singled out decidedly mixed opinions of the sequence. Let's sample some press reviews, for the story transcends routine hostility to difficult new music. Here, a reverse hierarchy obtained. Precisely by reaching audiences with music they could grasp, Max raised critical hackles. We begin with the press notices, but elements of this narrative we'll see affected more considered critical writings. One major voice, again, the Times critic and author Paul Griffiths, himself no stranger to Max's music, in 1988 deemed the notion of a cycle of Strathclyde concertos, quote, bizarre in an age which has lost confidence in musical genres, end quote. Praising Strathclyde No. 1, the 1987 oboe concerto, for, quote, clarity, calm, and even graciousness, Griffiths also noted that such qualities would have been extraordinary 20 years earlier. Max had moved from disjointed, violent, and extreme music to a smoother style. Griffiths nods briefly to genre, but his real concern is more abstract. In 1988, before the pieces were even written, he begins attacking the prospect of a cycle. Comparable, he says, not to Haydn, but less gloriously, quote, to Hindemith. 2 years later, ahead of a South Bank festival, Griffiths elaborated, taking a harsher line on Max's stylistic shift. Oh, I think I have the slides in the wrong order. No, I don't. His obvious point of reference is to the celebrated theatricality and expressionist manner of many of Max's works of the late 60s. And when we were talking about the music theatre, this is the recording. There's the nun with the megaphone and Max in Pierrot costume. So discounting the idea that Max had simply matured, Griffiths again attacks his sheer industry. Quote, in the last 15 years, his productivity has reached Hindemithian, even Mio-esque proportions. But the more damning point, perhaps, concerns the question of proper style. Griffiths observed a splintering of the early works, their turbulence and theatricality, as undercutting Max's later style. This is the article I'm quoting from the Times. The reality of the concertos is, quote, undecided there, since, quote, the forms of Western music are being paraded only on the surface. The grand facade is a disguise, end quote. I haven't found Griffiths retreating from this verdict in any later reviews. I did look, and his books as well. Other broadsheet critics initially echoed the paired attack on Max's productivity and the new lyricism. The Guardian's Gerald Larner in 1988 expressed somewhat vague reservations about, quote, expressive intentions and technical means. But he warmed to later Strathclydes. He reviewed many of them. By 1994, with most of the cycle complete, Andrew Porter, previewing the Fifth Symphony, revamped the issue of quantity and quality. Quote, Sir Peter has been accused of being a 20th century Telemann. It's hard to keep up with his output. End quote. Few critics voiced doubts as forcefully as Griffiths, and to be fair, a spectrum of views on the Strathclydes is legible. The Guardian's Andrew Clements was dismissive, but the Times' Stephen Pettit was far more welcoming. I'll contextualize these published opinions shortly. Before doing so, let's hear the music, or at least a bit of it, that they were reacting to. All but one of the Strathclydes run 30 minutes in performance, so I can only give you just a couple of snapshots. I'm sorry. But it's better than nothing. So this is first up is from number 2, William Conway's cello playing has already been mentioned for Vesalier Kones. This is the 1988 cello concerto. And I want to play you a little bit from the central movement. This is a section that Stephen Pruslin describes in his program note as inspired by Max's particular vision, quote, of a shoal of mackerel which swam into the bay below his clifftop house, creating a silvery iridescence of color and sound. Let's see if we can find that and get it to play. I'm so sorry to have to cut it off like that, but in the interest of time. Next, the bagpipe tune that Strathclyde Concerto No. 4 reaches at its still ending. For the clarinetist Lewis Morrison, Max selected a pibroch tune published in the early 19th century. As Richard McGregor notes, the concertos are structurally significant for Max's use of non-plain song tunes as sources for magic square-based pitch and rhythmic invention. So let me see if I can play this. Just the ending here. Okay. The press critics, of course, work quickly and must speak in few words. Their record is inevitably partial, though, as Christopher Dingle reminds us, its generally unguarded consideration, far from a fatal flaw, can be a source of value. From my own 2024 perspective, I don't share Griffith's late 80s reservations about these pieces of Max's. My own view today comes a generation on and in a different moment. But neither the abundance nor stylistic arguments convince me, frankly. Composers as prolific as Bach, Haydn, Hindemith, or Mio were undoubtedly uneven, but speed of production hardly detracts from the quality of their best work. And the critic's job to judge and select remains. I can't resist mentioning a literary parallel in Balzac's bustling comedy humaine, peopled by recurring characters and proliferating cross-references book to book, a massive fictional reality you get lost in. Jumping ahead briefly, Max would later describe the Naxos quartets as a novel written in chapters. To complain about a composer being fecund may reflect a mid-century system of musical consumption in which press critics moved, as Dingle asserts in a recent study of criticism, a move to commentary rather than event reporting and a press interest in star personalities. Students of 20th century British music press may equally recognize the often narrow range of opinions on offer and the durability of a given line once established. I think you know the scripts for Frank Bridge, Vaughan Williams, or Britten, or anyone guilty of using 12-tone rows in the UK at almost any date. These stories tend to look more like myths, or as I've argued elsewhere, stereotypes, aggressive and fearful responses to otherness, the unfamiliar, working as fetish by reiteration. As Sarah Collins recently observed of the earlier 20th century, various anti-intellectual tropes are rooted in discourses of decadence, cosmopolitanism, or British national character. The style question, meanwhile, Max's shift from expressionist to more lyrical melodic means or recognizable moments of tonal focus, as in the Concerto, must surely be considered within a wider historic geographic frame. Max's shift, was no wider surely than Schoenberg's After Verklärte Nacht, Carter's of the 40s, or Stravinsky's 1950s move from the rake's progress to movements. The great divide for 20th century audiences, a tonal-atonal split in pitch language that seemed strongest in the mid-century, had begun to recede by the 70s. A return of tonal feeling in Terry Riley's In C, Stockhausen's Stimmung, or Griset's Partielle, was one backdrop for Max's own stylistic journey. Griffith's puzzlement at a 1980s composer abandoning an expressionist manner itself feels a bit odd. Many others, Rochberg, Holloway, Schnittker, Ligeti, even Boulez, I would say, made comparable moves. One might speculate that Griffiths, an authority on Boulez, Messiaen, Barraquet, as well as early Davis, was personally disappointed by Max's evolution. But his argument about the reality of different styles, the Elizabethan, 20s foxtrot, and 60s atonal airs in St. Thomas Wake, for example, slips a bit too fast from awareness of stylistic and parodistic maneuvering to privileging the expressionist Max as somehow originary or authentic, or more authentic. These sketchy 2020s reservations of mine revisit Max's vocal press detractors of the 80s. But wait, the plot thickens. However negatively assessed by some press critics, Max's stylistic evolution received more even-handed, sophisticated assessment from journal writers with more time for reflection, score study, and more column space to articulate their comments. In the criticism of Arnold Whittle and of younger colleagues such as John Warnaby, one finds a sophisticated evaluation of Max's evolving 80s voice, free of hyperbole and richly detailed. Let me focus for a moment on Whittle's writings on Max, which begin, I think, in the 1960s, and include a superb series of music and letters reviews starting around 1976, which cover nearly all the major Max scores as they were published, the scores, beginning with World is Bliss, the Boozy and Hawk score. Whittle's sympathy and technical command of Davies's project is formidable, and I can only touch superficially here on all this most eloquent critic has to say. One emblem of Whittle's stance is his citation of Adorno in a 1994 article, specifically referring to a modernism in which, quote, integration and disintegration are intertwined. From such an angle, Whittle interprets that Strathclyde No. 4 coda we just heard as something more than simply a calm resolution. Quote, Orkney proved to be another vulnerable utopia, and Davies's musical metaphors for environmental and psychological betrayals of utopian ideas have restored the urgent relevance of polarity, not only the polarity of diverse tonal centers, but of centers asserted and centers denied. A dialectic which can cast a veil of ironic ambivalence over even the most apparently serene resolution. End quote. A defining trope here is that of classicizing modernism. In Arnold's writings, the phrase encapsulates a pitch language balancing tonal focus and floating atonality, with a corresponding ambivalence in the projection of formal coherence. In 1997, Whittle explored several aspects of Davies's evolution, beginning with the more rooted approach to harmony he perceived after the move to Hawaii. Mentioning the Second Symphony of 1980, among other works, Whittle mentions its deployment of a minor third-based scheme, pivoting from a B tonic to the modal dominant E sharp or F, with intervening D focus. In this late 20th century tonality, Whittle finds, Davies creates, quote, a device for balancing a tendency to fragmentation against an impulse to strive for synthesis, end quote. As precursors for the outer architecture and dramatic shapes of Davies's modernism, meanwhile, Whittle cites Sibelius and Mahler for, quote, progressive transformation of one movement into another, or prefiguring of one movement's features during its predecessor, end quote. In a powerful 2008 essay, and this is published in Maxwell Davies Studies, co-edited by Ken Gloag and Nick, Whittle further elaborates, reading some of Max's 1990 scores, which he reads as tied to the, quote, apprehensive yet stoical spirit of later Sibelius and a Mahlerian psychologically motivated striving for transcendence, end quote. Foregrounding a theory of pitch relations as a dialectic of floating and focused texture, or polarity versus convergence, Whittle has advanced an analytically precise account of Max's style and its evolution. Other writers in the 80s and 90s, notably John Warnaby, echoed such perceptions as the Strathclyde cycle unfolded. Still, even Warnaby could reiterate, albeit in less surly tone, facets of Griffith's stylistic puzzle thesis. Quote, Max may no longer wish to shock or surprise his audience, end quote. Warnaby wrote this in 1994 in a very insightful Tempo magazine review of Strathclyde's numbers 5 and 6. He also surveyed, in the same article, the 8 Strathclydes then extant. Quote, the initial impression is of remarkable consistency of style and quality, though anyone who experienced the original impact of Davies's most familiar scores may register a certain disappointment at the uncontroversial nature of the concertos. Still, they reflect not only his own preoccupations, but also a general trend away from a radical compositional outlook, end quote. David Wright, writing in 1993, the year before, quipped that, quote, Max must be tired of commentators remarking upon the obvious differences between his earlier music and the later gestures which mark his occupation of a more conventional centre ground, end quote. Wright's evocative descriptions of the first three Strathclydes convey his obvious admiration. Yet he too, referencing the earlier World is Bliss score, admits, quote, it's difficult to avoid the thought that as the music has become more mainstream, so it has become more constrained, seeming to lose some of its earlier resourcefulness and elemental power, end quote. My pencil sketch of Strathclyde's reception recalls the deep critical misgivings of the London-centric guild writers, number one, about the idea of a series, and number two, about Max's embrace of the traditional concert genre, the concerto. But why, we must ask, was this fact of genre so troublesome? I want to mention Matthew Gelbart's recent book, Musical Genre and Romantic Ideology, for his construal of genre not as a stylistic or technical category. It's not only his, but he's right about this. Genre as a social function of expectations and perceived transgressions as the work of audiences constructing mental categories. And I want to second Gelbart's claim that today's genre conversation remains beholden to a romantic ideology of capital A art, transcending taste and markets by sheer originality. Composers, too, will vary in their reverence or defiance of genres, but their choices ultimately meet other forces, institutional forces, including the press, broadcasters, publishers, and recording companies. Genre discourse circulates by reception. One takes seriously the notion of an individual composer's oeuvre as its own genre, while rejecting earlier 60s claims for an avant-garde death of genre. The young man Max was publicly labeled an avant-gardist, as we all know, and garnered a reputation, an image of defying traditional genres. Those Opus 2 piano pieces were called pieces, not ballads or elegies, and in parodic medievalism, he was writing in nomines, fantasias, or motets, orchestral works that also asserted certain distance from classical symphonic schemes in their titles. Max publicly was a composer with an established Stanislavski-like character script. How could he suddenly be writing concertos for a mainstream chamber orchestra? Bah, humbug. The British critics in the late Thatcher Britain unleashed their flurry of complaints, and amid the talk of quality, they murmured hazily about Max risking becoming a cult composer. Did this reflect some undocumented assumptions about his entrepreneurial relationship with Collins or Naxos Records, moments before online file sharing disrupted record industry sales? An iconoclast surely would not be operating like this, nor would a modernist suddenly provide folk song or Vegas-tinged crowd pleasers. But the naysaying we saw often tackled the abstract notion of a cycle of concertos, less frequently any given piece. And all those misgivings about style favor a rather comfortingly fixed image of the artist's evolving output. After the less than always celebratory reception of the Strathclydes in the early 90s, Max's cycle of 10-string quartets for Naxos Records, composed and released on CD by the Maggini Quartet over 5 years after 2001, provoked more immediate admiration. What had changed? By the new century, perhaps the critics were a decade further beyond the 60s avant-garde heyday and possibly more tolerant of some tonal illusions. Davies, too, was now reaching his 60s, approaching the career point at which BBC concerts and flattering portraits rather than bickering could be expected. Also, his new genre here, the string quartet, was always already less mainstream, more recondite historically than either symphony or concerto. The quartet throughout the 20th century claimed continued interest of neoclassicists and radicals alike. Cycles by modernists from Bartók and Shostakovich, also avant-gardists from Riem, Schnittke, Ackermann to Feldman, Fernihoe. The historical Viennese repertory codified earlier elaborate sonata and variation forms, and in late Beethoven, a repertory we know Max valued very highly, a private realm of extreme subtlety, emotional depth, and great formal ambition. The British field, meanwhile, that Max entered lacked a Bloom-style strong precursor. Tippett's and Britten's quartets were prized, but longer cycles such as McConchy's or Simpson's sadly never achieved a repertory status. It seems clear that Max's planning for the Naxos cycle was intrinsically conditioned by the recording format as well as live performance. Before the streaming era, the CD's 80-minute runtime favored his matching of one weighty quartet with a briefer companion. Number 7, Metafore sul Borromini, runs 53 minutes in performance, while number 8 takes under 20. And that's the one dedicated to Queen Elizabeth II. This Naxos quartet cycle truly is a maelstrom of extraordinary ambition and range, but my own time is running out. So I happily refer you to Nick Jones's examination of the F major theme of the Borromini quartet with Max's sonic evocations of light and volume within 6 Roman church interiors. For my own part, I want to return fleetingly to Arnold Whittle's classicizing modernism, quote, the balancing of the tendency to fragmentation against an impulse to strive for synthesis. The formulation is typically invoked to parse the pitch domain. Today, though, I want to emphasize fragmentation versus synthesis as a very surface, dramatic, formal concern. In 2 1994 scores, Strathclyde No. 9 and the Fifth Symphony, Max, as you know, explored a mosaic of tempo fluctuations. And he returns to this idea in Naxos No. 9, more than a decade later, a kind of montage of fast and slow musics. Max's own note explains, quote, for Naxos No. 9, quote, what is now the first movement was originally going to be 2 separate movements. I'm sorry. There we go. What is now the first movement was originally going to be 2 separate movements. The resulting compressed allegro is thus undermined by intruding slow elements, lifted from the discarded independent largo. End quote. So, in music's time-bound progress, Max is audibly shuttling between a strenuous allegro, one now, and slow music from another realm. As the vibrato esagerate trabalante, exaggeratedly shaky, you'll hear this in a moment, as that delivery in the violins makes clear, this is a work that draws attention self-reflexively in the moment of speaking to the precarity and contingency of norms of speech, conceptions of order, vulgarity, reality, and history. Let me try and play you this. How do we get this to play? Might need to do this. Here we go. As in Naxos number 9 itself, I have a micro finale. I reiterate the realities of genre as social construction, as position taking in a relational field. That field, Pierre Bourdieu famously noted, is mapped by, quote, discourses of direct or disguised celebration. Should we cut the critics some slack then? As creators of such discourse, the production of artworks requires the production of discourse about art. In pop genres too, David Brackett affirms an ever-shifting field defines itself by quotation and constant modification of conventions. One of Bourdieu's gnomic formulations stays with me, quote, all critics declare not only their judgment of the work, but also their claim to the right to talk about it and judge it, end quote. Our own perspectives on Max's music will continue to shift, but I feel sure we'll continue to talk and celebrate. Thank you. Let's see, I can.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah. Yeah. I can stop sharing in a second. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't overrun. Sorry, I probably did.
Well, we'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah,
actually.
I'd love to hear some questions if you have time.
Rather than me just use the time, has anybody got a direct question for Phil? Well, Phil, I'll make a start.
Sally has.
Sally.
I'd love to hear Sally's perspective.
Sally, you're muted, actually, a moment. You're still muted, Sally.
Down at the bottom.
There we go.
That's it.
Thank you. That was fascinating, Phil.
You're welcome.
And Arnold Whittle is a remarkable writer, actually. I just wanted to say very briefly that I think one of the problems of the Strathclyde concertos, and it struck me very forcibly when I heard the one for violin and viola with Lawrence Power and Daniel Hope and the ECO at King's Place,
Number 5.
not so far away, was just because they came along so fast. It was very difficult to really appreciate them, and they are remarkable. They are remarkable pieces of music, all of them. I mean, the cello ones you played, but I mean that one for violin and viola. It's a fantastic piece, very powerful, and I think because they came along so fast, people poo-pooed them and thought they were too easy and too glib and too quick. It's as simple as that, really.
Can I just make one point?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Robert.
Just two very brief things. I do wish that Paul Griffiths and various others would use their ears. If you listen to the cello solo in Vesalius, I think you'd know it was the same composer as the extract that you just played from the Strathclyde Concerto. And secondly, one interesting thing about that Strathclyde, unless I'm misreading the score, is that it ends F sharp major.
Yeah,
there's a B sharp in the
in
Yes.
the double basses. Now, this is something Alasdair Stout and Alasdair Nicolson were both talking about, and somebody else was mentioning the acuteness of Max's ear. Oh, Nick was about it going down an octave on the C. I mean, Max has undermined that. I know that the bass could have played a C sharp, but there are all sorts of things with that tritone at the bottom, and you have to listen very, very carefully. So even words like tonality, are they referring to structure or local references? I mean, you've made this very clear, Rupert, much better than I can, and I'll touch on it when I do a memoir in a minute. But I am particularly worried by the word style all the time, how much it's used compared to method or process.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I think, the critics sort of, I mean, they don't have much space, so they sort of rely on these shorthand things. And I mean, they had a story that the style had changed, but as you point out, it's not really true. And I mean, I think the tritone double bass there that undercuts the beautiful pure F major in the upper strings. I think that's what Arnold Whittle was hearing when he says that this is a vision of a utopia, but it's a utopia that's under threat. So it's just a much more complicated gesture.
Absolutely.
Than people are giving credit for, and it's also a subtle gesture because there's also the he's got the gong lying on top of the timpani, and that wavy line at the top of the score is giving you, again, in a subtle way, just a kind of, it's not exactly undercutting in a violent way, but just sort of a question mark around the innocence of that F sharp major, or the stability of it, or what it means. And yet it is also a tonality that's been prefigured throughout the previous 25 minutes and, feels right in a way. So I think you're absolutely right that the notion of style isn't really adequate to some of those things. And they're not really capturing the full subtlety of what he's doing at that point.
Well, it's also, I think, F sharp major has some symbolic significance for him. I never could quite work out what it was, but there's something about the key. So that's another message which is hidden there, but it's a personal message which perhaps.
Right.
So that might explain why the C is undermining that. If you listen carefully to it, it's interesting because I think the critics were like they did with Wolfgang Riem. They sort of went, so much music must affect on the quality. That's the the simple equation that is made. Too much music, therefore we lose a quality, and that's clearly not the case. It's just that they lose their perspective, and perhaps critics are too ready to think of a word as having all its historical significances. And therefore, you must expect certain things to happen within it. Concerto has its history, therefore it has some kind of expectation lying underneath that. The genre has a sort of hold over people. No, thank you, Nick. I think we're already sort of into the time. Do you want to have the break now?
Yeah, I think we will have the break now. We'll be back at 3:00. Is that okay for everyone?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
See you in 10.
Right.
Thanks, Philip.
Right. Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Phil, for your excellent paper.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading some of that in print eventually. So thank you very much indeed. So we're moving on to Robert Saxton. And Robert was born in London and started composing at the age of 6, and guidance in early years from Benjamin Britten and lessons with Elizabeth Lutyens was followed by periods of study at both Cambridge as an undergraduate and Oxford as a postgraduate with Robin Holloway and Robert Sherlaw Johnson, respectively, and also with Luciano Berio. He won the Gaudeamus International Composers Prize in Holland at the age of 21. And in 86, he was awarded the Fulbright Arts Fellowship to the USA, where he was in residence at Princeton. He became a DMUS in 1992 and was elected an honorary fellow of St. Catherine's College in Cambridge in 2015. His recent compositions include the opera The Wandering Jew, a song cycle for baritone, for the baritone Roderick Williams, Time and the Seasons, Resurrection of the Soldiers, Shakespeare Scenes, a fourth string quartet, fantasy pieces for the Fidelio Trio, and most recently, a collaboration with Jonathan Clinch. And he premiered Robert's Tombeau for HB for organ in autumn 2022 and has commissioned a major organ cycle as part of a project with the Royal Academy of Music. So in his talk, Robert will be remembering Max. So Robert, over to you, sir.
Thank you. My first encounter with Max was not personal, but in our local library, which now I realize many years later, and I'm talking now about the mid-1960s, was very well stocked with scores and records, LPs. We were very lucky. And I remember taking out the Leopardi fragments and the St. Michael Sonata. And particularly the St. Michael Sonata, I was completely bowled over by. And I then, not long after, discovered the second Taverner Fantasia, which I found a deep resonance with. I use the word resonance in a very wide sense. It's the same sort of resonance I'd found on with Tippett's second string quartet, which was one of my A-level set works, and the Vision of St. Augustine of Tippett. I'd just like to make a point. I know it's been covered a bit today, but if I can, and then I'll go on to my memories of, my memories of working with Max. If it's any longer acceptable to describe modernism as basically urban, which I think has been touched on today, then I suppose, and I can only suppose 60 years later, that I felt an affinity and still do with English modernism, such as I find in the works of a sculptor such as Epstein, who I know was American, but painters such as Revilius, Stanley Spencer, and Paul Nash, and indeed Barbara Hepworth, where a wider vision seemed to me to be fundamental. I also find it in Auden's poetry. And in some of the best works of my teacher, Elizabeth Lutyens. So analysing it for today, I think I feel closer to those artists who employed what we might call the trappings of modernism, if I'm allowed to say that, at the service of saying something beyond, the surface. Now, in terms of Max's music, I felt and still do that while many of his contemporaries abroad were experimenting in various ways, he was determined to approach problems such as long-range structural tension and resolution from an angle which, far from denying the past, embraced it. And as a result, it was technically and expressively aiming to synthesize elements in a way that I still respect and love very deeply. I'm not denying the extraordinary achievement of a work like Stockhausen's Gruppen, which I still think is one of the extraordinary works. But Max's second Taverner Fantasia, while in no way communicating in any kind of retro manner, seems to chime with, say, the ethos of someone like of Basil Spence in designing the new St. Michael's Cathedral, Coventry, for which, of course, Britten wrote the War Requiem, 1962, where modernism across several branches of the arts recreates a sense of historical perspective and atmosphere, which in doing so becomes a commentary on the past and on our own times, and hopefully a beacon for the future. All aspects of this cathedral seem to me to rejoice in the service of a holistic conception, And like Birtwistle, Max, in a very different way, was a profoundly British composer who, like Purcell, learnt a vast amount from continental practices, but went on to absorb and make these his own. Solutions to compositional problems were empirical. Max was, I suggest, like Shakespeare, inclusive, and also like Chaucer and the slightly later satirical John Skelton, artistically and brilliantly irreverent and satirical, as I've said, always grist to his mill. He didn't use his technical wizardry to create a closed system, but on the contrary employed method to produce and enhance whatever challenge he faced. So much for my attempt to analyse the excitement I experienced when I first encountered Max's music and ideas. I first saw and heard him work at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London when it was a quite new hall, in the early days when the Pierrot players, which have already been mentioned, were osmosing into the fires of London. I was about 14, 15, and I attended a concert at which Max appeared in turquoise corduroy trousers and Angora purple sweater and ankle boots. He was very embarrassed by this when I mentioned it to him many years later. The programme included the premiere of Birtwistle's verses for ensembles, Max's Stedman doubles, and Sandy Gurr's paraphrase on Monteverdi's Tancredi and Clorinda, played with the usual flair by the wonderful Alan Hacker. I could hardly sleep that night. I can still recall my excitement. And I encountered Max in person just after leaving school. Susan Bradshaw, the pianist who I'd met via Elizabeth Lutyens and who was herself a pupil of Pierre Boulez, was the repetiteur for the premiere of Max's Blind Man's Buff, a theatre piece to be conducted at a BBC Roundhouse concert by Pierre Boulez. Susan invited me to act as her page turner for a rehearsal at St. John Smith Square in London. I arrived with great trepidation and heard sounds inside. I gingerly knocked at the immense door of St. John's, which was immediately opened by Max, who, with a large grin and a sweeping hand gesture of the sort one might associate with the butler in a stately home, greeted me. I attended the rehearsal and the concert as well at the Roundhouse, being somewhat puzzled and amused by what was evidently complete incomprehension on Boulez's part of Max's new theatre piece, in which Alan Civil, the principal horn of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and a great character, was dressed in a luminous green medieval-style shirt with huge sleeves. Boulez looked totally gobsmacked, which I presume amused Max no end. Dear old Boozle, Max called him when he and I were teaching together some years later. When I was at university, the music faculty paid for a group of us to attend a new music event, Musica Nova, at Glasgow University. That was 1973. 3 pieces had been commissioned, one each from Berio, Ligeti and Max. Berio was unwell, so Ligeti and Max presided. We attended rehearsals of Ligeti's double concerto for flute and oboe and orchestra, and Jan de Gaetani was the vocal soloist in Stone Litany. Max is very evocative and one of his early Orkney pieces, with the Scottish National Orchestra and Alexander Gibson. I remember one morning when Ligeti and Max were leading a session for us students, a large group from all over the UK. Ligeti gave a lecture and then Max took over. He was clearly determined to change the atmosphere from Ligeti's fascinating but intense lecturing style, and told a story about how when he'd been writing all day, he had one evening sat on the cliff, or a garden near the cliff, to relax on Hoy, when a little pink cloud hovered above him in a kind of benediction. Ligeti's expression at this point was one of total bewilderment. One student asked Max how he organised his pitches. Again, to Ligeti's total consternation, Max, in his most theatrical manner, said that all composers must have a large hat, and that he had one. He proceeded to explain that he wrote a magic square on manuscript paper and then cut out each pitch class to create individual tiny squares. He said he put these in the large hat, whizzed it round, and then threw the pieces of paper in the air. However, they landed. This gave him the pitches he then used. We were all taking notes, scribbling away, only to realize that Max was taking the piss in order to lighten the tone of the session. In the early 1980s, the wonderfully bold and forthright Radio 3 music producer Veronica Slater, who in her younger days had been one of Vaughan Williams' regular guest companions at concerts, was appointed to an administrative post at Dartington Summer School. She suggested to Max, who was then director of the summer school, that he needed an assistant for the composition class and suggested to him that I might do this job. Max invited my wife, Tessa Carhill, and I to dinner at his London flat, and we had a wonderful dinner cooked, needless to say, by Max. A few days later, the submitted scores for the composition class arrived, and Max and I went through them in detail. No hovering pink clouds or large sorting hats this time. Intense and 100% professional was the attitude, with the occasional quip from Max, such as, "I don't think much of this one, too much like avant-garde music." I was Max's assistant for 2 successive years at Dartington, 83 and 84. It was a mind-blowing experience. The set works for the composition class were Schoenberg's First Chamber Symphony, which fortunately I knew well because I'd conducted it several times as a student, and Janacek's Wind Sextet Mladi. Max was direct. He told me that he would analyze the Schoenberg, as he didn't understand what was going on in the Janacek, and I would do the Janacek. I invariably took such remarks from him with a large pinch of salt. I think I was being tested, but in a friendly way. As a result, I learnt much, both analytically and in terms of work ethos, and no recordings were allowed. All examples had to be played on the piano. Now, Alasdair mentioned earlier about arrangements. We had the Brodsky Quartet and in residence, and one of the tasks Max set the students was to orchestrate or string quartetize the first part of the first movement of Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata. Now, of course, Max did this with something of a grin, and he said to me, "I wonder how many of them will think of transposing it into D major, which is a much better key for the strings." And of course, needless to say, next day some people said they were stuck because they'd had to ask the cellist to tune the C string down to B flat. And Max said, "Oh, no, you don't. You've not rethought, you haven't understood the process or the tonal structure. You've just looked at the notes. That's not good enough." He was also very, very fussy, as Alasdair has mentioned, about, and Nick, about notation. And I remember him devoting a good chunk of one morning class in that round room at Dartington to that. He said that note heads had to be like boiled eggs. They should not round, and they're not just little dots with the stem over here. And he was very, very fussy about hearing, and of course, he said the same to the class as Elizabeth Lutchins had said to me. She said, "Look, we know Beethoven was untidy, but he didn't think untidily." There could be many reasons for Beethoven's bad handwriting, like Vaughan Williams, who I understand was probably left-handed and made to write with his right hand or something. But, don't get muddled up by that. You must be neat and clear and understand how everything lines up. I found Max entirely inspiring to work with, and sometimes we would have amazing discussions. I was getting very, very exercised about organizing my pitches in terms of, I suppose, what you might call harmonic rhythm. And I was trying to deal with this. I was dealing with the total chromatic at the time in the works I was writing. And Max and I discussed the relationship between horizontals and verticals. I was talking to him about fixing pitches in their octaves, as for example, Webern in the Webern's Symphony Opus 21, which I'd studied with Berio. And Max and I were talking about what you actually hear as opposed to what you think or theoretically think are told you ought to hear. Even triads in root position, in certain places. I mean, there's a wonderful analysis of the Stockhausen by Stockhausen in Perspectives of New Music of the Webern String Quartet, where he shows how many of intervals that one might not initially think Webern uses, he does, because contextually the voice leading does certain things. And Max and I talked about these sort of things a lot, although he did also, of course, needless to say, being Max, come up with some wonderful stories about how he and Burt Whistle had corpsed with laughter at Darmstadt when Stockhausen was being po-faced and all that sort of thing. During my first year at Dartington, I was fortunate enough to have my first prom. And it was going to be Ollie Nusson's first prom as a conductor, conducting my piece. It was a piece that Ollie had commissioned for an American orchestra, and the performance in America had been delayed by a year, and the wonderful controller, Robert Ponsonby, had very generously put it in the 1983 proms and said, well, let's give it a UK premiere first. And I think I got promsitis. I was terribly nervous, I think, looking back. And I spoke to Max about this, and he said, what is worrying you? Something's not right. One morning after we'd finished teaching, and I said, oh dear, was I teaching badly? And he said, no, but I know something's worrying. You come up to my room later. And I went up and I said, I just want to withdraw this piece, Max. And he said, now, just let me have a look at it. And have you got the score here? I said, yes, I've got the score in my room. He said, go and get it and bring it up. And he said, leave it with me all night. The next day, I showed him what I was worried about. He came down and he said, leave it. Leave it. Let it go ahead. I'd explained to him what the problem was about a join with another section. And I was psychologically thinking, because this section had been revised and inserted, that somehow it was like a brick wall in the piece. I think all composers know that feeling. And Max said, no, I've really looked it through. Leave it. Now, this is, I think, quite amazing, really. I went up to the Albert Hall later on for the rehearsal and performance with Ollie. And I went round to Ollie's dressing room in the Albert Hall afterwards. We were going out for a curry, I think. And Max suddenly appeared. And Ollie Nusson said, Max, what are you doing here? And I said, Max, you're at Dartington. He said, yes, I am, but I've come up to see if I was right. See, I was. See you back at Dartington. Now, that is an extraordinary in terms of care, education, if you like. I mean, I didn't know what to say. And we said, come and have a curry. He said, no, I've got to get back. I also witnessed at Dartington a case where a lady was having to go because she'd run out of funds. I think she'd come to play the viola in quartets or something. And Max said, no, this is not right. And he arranged immediately for her to be able to stay. I mean, extraordinary things, really. And if I may just tell one anecdote, this is not deeply to do with pitch classes or magic squares, but Max's mother died during my first year with him at Dartington, and he had to go off and look after his father. And he said to me, I'm going to leave you, the office knows exactly what to do, but you're nominally in charge. And I thought, oh my God, and he said, I'll tell you what to do and I'll phone in every day. So anyway, Ollie Nusson came down with the Flowers of London and they were doing a concert. And after, it was a very hot evening. And afterwards, we went for a swim in the higher closed swimming pool. And it was, Philip Davies, Steve Pruslin, all the usual crew. And Ollie Nusson, who couldn't bear anything to do with sport, sat by the side of the pool with a big bottle of wine, pouring out glasses. And we swam towards the edge and had Suddenly a window flew open and a lady said, "What's going on down there? I'm trying to sleep." And she said, "This is disgraceful and I'm going to report you all. Who are you?" to the director. So I went under her window and I said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry. I'm actually holding the fort at the moment." And she said, "Well, you should know better." And she said, "It's disgraceful." It was only about 9:30, you know. Anyway, the next day, Max had come back, and I went into the office to find out what if anything needed doing on behalf of Max. And Max was sitting there, ashen-faced, and the whole office were like this. And he said, "I want to speak to you." That's what he said. "I go away for one day, and the whole thing has fallen to pieces," or words to that effect. "This is a total disgrace." And I said, "I'm terribly sorry, Max. I don't know what." He said, "Well, it's no good just being sorry. This is absolutely appalling. Look at this letter." So I looked and it said, "Dear Mr. Davies, last night there was a riot outside my window. There was a large person called Dolly pouring out wine and a very small person who claimed to be your deputy." I thought, so I said, "Well, what do I do?" And he said, "You go now. You've got her name, you've got her room number, and you go and you knock on the door. And when she opens it, you say, 'I am the person you spoke to last night, and I have a message from the director.' Piss off, you silly old fart." And he completely collapsed with laughter. And he'd played it so brilliantly that the whole office and I thought I was about to be sacked. And I'm sorry to use four-letter words, but it was terribly funny. And it was 5 of the worst minutes of my life, actually. Then I went on after that. I taught again with Max in 1984 at Dartington. Then I went as a lecturer to Bristol University. And Max commissioned me to write a piece for the Fires of London. It was an interesting program. It was Max's Image, Reflection, Shadow, which was like a marimba concerto, and a piece I wrote called The Sentinel of the Rainbow, and Elliot Carter's triple duo. And Max asked me if I could go round on the tour and introduce the program because he couldn't do it all. So I did that for him. And it was tremendous generosity commissioning this piece. And again, he programmed it at the Purcell Room some years later when he did a composer's choice evening. I then taught with him on Hoy in the 1990s. Alasdair can probably put me right into, I think it must have been 1994.
Ooh, my memory these days is not great, but it may well have been. Yeah.
Because I was with Sally Beamish, and I think it was before you and Sally then taught with Max.
Yeah. It probably, that would figure.
Yes. And I had a wonderful time with him on Hoy. Again, we had players in residence from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and it was a great joy, a double joy, because Sally Beamish and I were the 2 juniors, and Sally Beamish and my sister had been at school together, so I'd known her since she was 6. And so we had this wonderful sort of reunion. And I just again found working on Haydn's Opus 76 No. 1 Quartet, the first movement. I still use it if I'm asked to do a class for composers, because what Max got out of it and what we also discovered together, I think, was quite extraordinary. Max was a referee for my post at Oxford. later on. And I have a really rather wonderful story of when he presented he started a medal. Some of you may remember this as Master of the Queen's Music, and he presented it to the National Youth Orchestra. And the Queen, my wife and I were there. The Queen was presenting it, and what was quite extraordinary there was that Max, this time in his, jacket and not in a turquoise and chorus, organized the whole thing on the stage, and the Queen went up looking rather like somebody who was imitating the Queen on one of those shows, with her handbag. And you did, for a good Republican, Max was amazing, because one wondered who was actually running the show. He'd say to the Queen, "Your Majesty, just move there," and he took over the whole thing, and the Queen did exactly what he said, as if she was a chess piece. That was quite unbelievable, quite surreal and wonderful. Also, another story which I think is worth noting about Max's amazing personality, which of course you all know. My wife was for some years a governor of the Royal Society of Musicians, and there was an issue of them not having had a patron since the Queen Mother had died. And the Royals, as everybody knows, are very, very busy and, taking on new societies. And I said to my wife, "Why don't you talk to Max?" She said, "Well, I can't." And I said, "Yes, you can." So when he was down at the academy one day, she went to see him. And needless to say, she came home and I said, "How did you have a good chat?" And she said, "Oh, God," he opened the door with a glass of white wine and we got through half a bottle. And a few days later, a message came, the Queen was going to do it herself and become patron. And I just think those sort of gestures of Max's were absolutely extraordinary. Then, when he was ill, I have a connection where I go in occasionally to the Purcell School for Young Musicians and do projects with them. And they were playing a piece of Max's at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And Max came and he told me he wasn't well. And I used to go and see him in hospital at UCH in London, because I'd have gone anyway, but my mother was in a care home not far away. So every week I went in to see her. I went in to see Max first. And again, when you think what he was going through, and he was writing the 10th Symphony, I said to him, "Is that a magic square?" He said, with the woolly hat on, and he said, "Yes, but I'm not using it much. That'll give people doing PhDs a lot to think about, won't it?" And even then, having had chemotherapy that morning, I mean, unbelievable, really. I'm going to shut up now. All I can say, I've just got here a little photo of Max getting his doctorate at Oxford, with me sort of trying to oversee the proceedings in front of one of Oxford's finest building sites. But all I can say is that I learnt enormous amount of teaching with Max. I think I learnt, apart from the intense lessons with Liz Lutchins when I was much younger, I learnt more from him than from anybody, about being professional, about thinking about structure, long-term structure, about the nature of thinking things through. And as Alasdair has made clear, sometimes he could be very silent, sometimes he would offer a lot out of one detail. I owe him so much that I can't say any more, really, except that I miss him hugely. I really do.
Robert, thank you so much. That was such a touching, fascinating series of reminiscences of Max.
Sorry about my bad language, but I was quoting.
No. You could use a lot worse than the word you use. So thank you. What I'm going to do, because I know that Richard McGregor was at the 1973 premiere of Stone Litany. And I know that talking to Richard, he's got a lovely story that you probably want to share with us all now. So over to you, Richard.
Well, yes, I was there in 1973, Stone Listening made a great impression on me. And then Stephen Arnold, I studied with Stephen Arnold, and he had the sketches for the second Taverner Fantasia. So that was one of the set works that we had. So I've still got the sketch notes that I got from that piece. But the story was about Ligeti. I was in on one of the rehearsals. Now, people really criticised Alexander Gibson for his technique, circular. Yeah. But the players weren't exactly. I don't know how you describe them, but they weren't exactly sympathetic in times. But they were playing this particular part of a large texture, and Ligeti stopped the orchestra, and he said to the double bass player in this huge texture, "Excuse me, you played an E flat. It's an E natural." I mean, so what a tremendous ear that he must have had to be able to hear that. But there was another story. William Bennett, the flute player, was talking to Ligeti that day in the forum. I don't know, you may remember this, Robert. And he was struggling with what to say to Ligeti to describe what he was talking about. He was trying to talk about the fact that Ligeti's music moved very slowly and changed colours and textures. So, and he went, "Mr. Ligeti, your music is like a big slug."
I do remember.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I can't remember what Ligeti did.
I can't remember either.
I think one thing I would just say, if I may add, of course, one of the things that struck me, going back to the beginning of what I said, was that the Ligeti was a bit like, I suppose, looking at a Bridget Riley painting or something, whereas the Max seemed to be, I'm not using this to criticize Ligeti, a completely different artist, but what I meant about English or British artists was that the Max was clearly using what Paul Griffiths might think of as an advanced language or grammar, but at the service of an enormous idea about time, and as Alasdair said, about the history of the Orkneys, etc. And one always sensed that there was some enormous vision behind this, which I think does run through Shakespeare, Bunyan, whatever. Yeah.
Yes. Very evocative work, if you don't know it.
Incredible.
Before we move into the round table, I just wanted to ask anyone if you've got a question for Robert. I've just got a quick one. I'm fascinated, Robert, what you said about you went into your local. I think you said your local library, and there's LPs there, etc. And St. Michael's Sonata, Leopardi Fragments, and later the second Taverner Fantasia. I mean, the St. Michael's Sonata, a piece he wrote in the 1950s, not something which is well known. What was it about that piece that really grabbed you?
Well, it's very difficult to say. The quick answer to that is I don't know, but it could even been the colour of the binding. I don't know, but I think I listened to it. There was a recording, actually. I think there was a recording, unless I tried to bash it out on them. It's 17 wind instruments, isn't it? As far as I found, as I did with the second Taverner Fantasia, something about, how can I put this? Is it topological, not geometrical? There's something about the structural rigor instinctively related to this, to me, exciting sonic world. That sounds terribly pretentious, which I just found completely extraordinary. but I'm a bit odd. Well, I know I am, because I knew at the university, I was at university in the early 70s there. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter now. Nobody seems to care about anything. Whoops, sorry, I'm showing my age. But I mean about whether Boulez was right or Britain was right or Schoenberg was wrong or Telemann wrote too much. But the thing is that I, for example, could quite easily take in Pli Selon Pli and Curlew River, both works by people with extraordinary ears and a refined sin. And so I don't have, maybe it's because I'm partly British, partly continental, I don't know, but I don't have those sort of issues. And so with Max, I almost felt the vision the way I had with Tippett, Parce Peter Evans, which I didn't know about. I just felt it so exciting, and also it seemed to me I knew some of Webern's music. I'd listened to those BBC radio, the Thursday third programme invitation concerts I'd listened to as a boy, where you heard No and Modena and Webern and in fact I first heard Liz Lutyens' music on one of those. Somehow it was the excitement too of this huge range that Max seemed to be able to. In other words, when I mentioned Stockhausen's Gruppen, it does. I know it's got an overall plan, but it does come out in not moment form because it's pre-moment form, but and Boulez is Pli Selon Pli. The movements are relatively short. Max seemed to be going for this cathedral-like sense of something. Does that make sense? I know that may be a common image, but I felt it very strongly as an early teenager. It was something that just struck me, and it's something I always wanted to talk to Max about, and did try to. I didn't always get an answer, as Alasdair would know, but this incredible sense of the relationship between pre-planning in a really rigorous way and the sort of local freedom, like you can move the pews but the building is still the building with the flying buttresses. And I remember I did discuss this sort of thing with Max quite a lot, actually. Does that help a bit?
It does. It certainly does. Yes. Thank you. Excellent. So we are bang on time again. We're doing well here. We're going to move into our final session. And this is we've just called it a roundtable discussion. And Richard and I have composed 8 questions. We probably won't get through all 8, but who knows, we might do. Now, Richard and I are going to kind of chair this session. So I will kick things off, and we shared these questions with Phil, with Robert, and with Alasdair, so that they know what the questions are, and we can bring in people if anyone wants to say anything or respond to any of the speakers. Just put your hand up, and we can bring you in whenever. So my first question then, the title of this roundtable, Labyrinth to Light, is inspired by a song for soprano and piano that Max wrote in 2008. In spite of its very interesting text, and I'll pop the text in the chat in a moment for you to have a look at, we are, of course, using the title as a metaphorical springboard for discussion. So my question, and I'll address this to Alasdair first. Haven't heard from you for a long time. What aspects of Max's music or life suggest to you the notion of moving from labyrinth or darkness to light? Or do you think Max tended to avoid this impulse?
Thankfully, you did give us the questions beforehand, so I did have a think about this. And I suppose in life terms, I wouldn't like to comment in many ways, but in as I thought about it, the famous and intimate and long-lasting collaboration that he had was with George Mackay-Brown. And to some extent, what that talks about, Labyrinth and the darkness to light, etc., is very much, much more easily understood, if you like, in the poetry of George Mackay-Brown. And therefore, I would say that, and indeed, just from the two further conversations we've had, I was further thinking about this as we went through, thinking, George's poetry perhaps represents Max's music quite well as a sort of description of some of the things that go on and the issues. If one needed to bring into words what Max's music was about, and ironic then that they become very good friends and work collaboratively together. But I felt that, for a lot of the pieces that either rely on a poem of George's or indeed set something that George had written, that sense of darkness to light, the labyrinth, the runic, the sunrise to sunset, the season, and therefore darkness to light, the solstice, all of that is very much within that poetic world, but actually translates very well into, I think, Max's musical world to an extent, not only as inspiration from the Mackay-Brown, but actually just within its own right. So, I think, as I say, it's no surprise to an extent that, though they met rather randomly in Orkney, that they became bosom buddies and were, very significant in one another's world. And I think that sense of light and dark is, absolutely key to that.
Yeah. Thank you. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that's when we first got these questions in the email, you're opening your email and you think, oh, well, this is a bit different from, memo for the faculty meeting or something. But I think this is really a great first question because and following on from what Alasdair just said, it sort of homes in on the really big stuff and what Robert was talking about, the sort of kind of a grand vision. That sounds pretentious, but that I think we all feel in the music. And I think the problem, I was talking about critics and of course, as a musicologist, one writes about scores and so on, but sometimes you wonder, well, it's not that it's not important to talk about how the notes are put together or how the form works, but is that really getting at the larger, the emotional meaning, the historical meanings that this music evokes, and what? So sometimes I really worry that the technical discussion of music, which I've been guilty of doing, but is too focused on the things that are sort of easier to grasp. Robert was talking about the notation, and obviously any composer is going to think about the analyst comes along and says, aha, there's a magic square, or there's a row, or there's a triad, and aha, this is pay dirt. We're going to talk about this. And it's not that you don't want to talk about it, but it's like that, that's just the artist's, the thing the artist was using at that moment to say something. And I mean, that's obvious in a way, but it's just the way the art, the kind of discourses that inevitably spring up around the project, to go back to the idea of the way the art is received, they sort of set in motion an image that is limiting and prejudiced towards structure, and doesn't necessarily get you thinking about something like solstice or the quality of light on the water that someone's been watching for 50 years from their window. That is equally important for how, when they get up in the morning and go back to page 4 of the score and start writing. It's not a conscious thing necessarily, but so, I think there's great value in the kind of, this is what's remarkable, frankly, about some of Arnold Whittle's writings about Max, because I can't think of any other critic who's written more about Max actually over a longer period. It's almost unprecedented. And, you know, I mean, Arnold's perfectly aware of 12-tone rows and magic square workings and so on, and rhythmic doings, but he's interested in connecting some of the later works with a sort of Mahlerian notion of transcendence. I mean, you know, of course, it's hard to pin these things down, but I think the poem you've given us here, you know, the man of double deed and 'twas death and death and death indeed. I mean, this is where the pedal hits the metal for an artist. This is the existential stuff that drives you to write those symphonies. Or I mean, and we know that Mahler had preoccupations, having lost a brother he was close to as a teenager. We know that Britten was preoccupied with thinking about death, and I mean, we know that Max was profoundly involved in the environment he was living in, and exercised by political questions of, you know, the Iraq War and the Third Naxos Quartet. So, I mean, I think this kind of thematic, sorry, I'm dragging on a little bit here, but I think this kind of poetic, metaphorical understanding is as meaningful as any kind of structural, which isn't to denigrate the structure. I mean, I must say that, you know, because without the structure, no art, right? You know.
Thank you, Phil. Robert.
Well, I'm interested in the opening line. I mean, this is a well-known piece of poetry. Double deed. I mean, double deed there is presumably negatively critical, but without meaning it in that sense, then we've already talked about Max, you know, from Revelation and Fall to one of the Naxos quartets. And it seems to me that we're going back to the fox and hedgehog business, aren't we? I mean, Harry Birtwistle and Max as the fox and hedgehog. But it seems that there's a sort of, I don't know quite how to, I don't know if you two agree or everyone else here. There's a struggle to me in Max. I was one day walking along the street with him, and he was very, very silent, and I got vibes of really quite dark vibes. I don't mean sinister. I don't mean that, but I felt that perhaps he was always trying to conquer something. That's where the power comes from. And so the first line, it's not literally that there were double deeds, but there's more than a double, there's a very complex personality there. As that unfolds, it's almost like a metaphor for Mac trying to struggle, whether it's, I presume it is towards the light, isn't it? I mean, if you think of the, you could suppose call it urban modernism of, you know, the megaphone and the red nun and the screaming nun, and towards Orvelius, the theatrical gesture and the underpants on the head or whatever. And then you think of the what you were talking about, Philip, in the late works. That is of, it's not to me just from one state to another, it's from can I just quote one thing that I'm sorry to keep mentioning Liz Lutyens, but she said something very important to me once about Max. She said, there's a problem sometimes with Max's imagery. And I said, what do you mean? She said, or references. And I said, what do you? She said, well, you see, Max will quote a foxtrot. I can't remember this literally now. I'm going, but she said, look, love, puffing her cigarette. Max will think of a foxtrot as perhaps something not evil, but, you know, from where he was Salford in those days, in the sort of Britain in the 50s, and sort of you know, whatever. She said most of us, the foxtrot is actually something a straightforward believer, but she found sometimes she thought it was easy to miss because the images he ate, but it didn't half make me think. And I sometimes wonder if Max was trying to escape from something, and the landscape and Orkney business love was his way of getting to the light. Does that make any sense at all? I don't know.
Unfortunately, you broke up a little bit, but no, it's okay. I think we got your main point. So yes, absolutely.
That may have been Matt agreeing with what I was saying.
Yes. We're going to move on to our second question, but I'm just going to open the floor just in case any of the other people here would like to comment on any of the comments that were made by our three speakers. No, give you the opportunity now. Okay, Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. It does occur to me that There Was a Man of Double Deed comes very soon after the Michael Arnold affair. So, I mean, there could easily be a sort of slighting reference there. No, we're moving, I think, on to Max himself. And writing to Gerard McBurney in 1991, some of you will know this, he was talking about Blind Man's Buff at that time, which we've already mentioned. He talks about that work as an identity crisis expressed through mask imagery. And then he carries on and say that I enjoy wearing masks. You can make otherwise impossible statements behind a mask. So it's this idea of masks that often they feature predominantly in Max's works, and whether it's whether it's in connection with stylistic masks or symbolic masks or issues associated with personal identity. So the question really is, who was the real Max? Because a lot of things were behind masks. Certainly in public, you would think when he was introducing himself and his works, he put on a mask. You could tell. You know, I think Peter Owens, who's with us here, talked about that they creating your sort of like a story, your history, your mythology. In order to define things. That was way back in the late 1990s, Peter, was it not? But can I ask, sort of, Alasdair again, is that the real Max? Did you come across the real Max? Did you see these masks in use?
I definitely saw the masks in use in many ways, that being, you know, as a human being, and of course as a composer. I mean, you know, I suppose even Robert's just to look at the music momentarily, but looking at what Robert was talking about, you know, and Liz Lutyens and foxtrots, etc. You know, there's an awful lot of that parodying of other kinds of music, which is masks being applied in a very technical musical sense. You know, used for either the effect they might have or the perceived effect they might have, I suppose. So I think, you know, there were masks within the compositional technique beyond masks on people's faces in a performance, I would certainly say. But yeah, Max had many versions of himself that were apparent depending on the occasion, etc. But, and, you know, I will be very candid, as a male who is gay of a certain generation, and I speak as one, that was part of your personality in certain periods of history. Not to get too sort of personal about me or anyone, but you know, to be many different people and to mask certain things or whatever is not unfamiliar to me, partly because of the nature of society, etc. Never mind the musical world or whatever, just generally speaking, that that one learns to navigate, and probably further back in history had to learn to navigate a wee bit more carefully, who you were presenting and who you were at any given moment. And I'm sorry, that takes it into the truly personal, but I think that that's important to remember because, you know, the personality that one presents as an artist or a composer or whoever it is can be multifaceted, but also just as a human being, what you want people to see. And I think Max was, I think I saw Max through a person that was possibly more careful and more reserved, unless he was truly off duty, and then you got the true story. But you know, was more reserved and careful about who he revealed everything to, than might be expected from one that might have been known in his later life, who was perhaps more expressive and more, you know, less held back by feeling like you had to say the right thing or whatever. He would just come out with it. So I think there's a sort of complexity, and it's probably a complexity of, you know, society and what one was allowed to be without that being a problem, etc. That may not be at the root of your question, but I think for me it sort of struck me as I was considering it.
Robert, your perspective on that? You're muted, I think.
On what Alasdair's just said.
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't. I mean, it's not for me to say, but it rings just totally true. I mean, Britain dealt with this from a different generation one way. Tippett, obviously, completely different personality. With Max, I think that's hit the nail bang on the head. And yet, the greatness to me of him as a musician, composer, person was that underneath it, he seemed to have this extraordinary power and even, dare I use the word, grit, which, like a girder, somehow managed to see him through. He was very honest with me about all sorts of things, as he was, I'm sure, with a lot of, or some of us, when he was, as it were, Alasdair rightly says, off duty. I remember one night at Dartington, I won't go into details, when we were preparing next day's teaching in his room, he was very honest with me about all sorts of things. And I think I have no more to say. I just think Alasdair's completely right. I mean, there's nothing, it's completely brilliant way of putting it.
But I think also there was the question of his birth, the mysteriousness of his you know, Sandy and Harry, and they couldn't work out where he came from. You know, he seemed like a creature from somewhere completely different from Salford, and you know, and he had fluent German from a very early age, and he just had an otherness, you know, which Sandy always recognised and was fascinated by. So I think he was dealing with that too, a lot.
He was, I mean, he was, you know, he did come from Salford in the sense of being a bit of a, I think Robert's right, you know, was that really certain and steely core that was a bit of a street fighter, you know, and just for all the things that might have been around, you know, Max was very strong, actually.
Yes.
Phil.
Oh, sorry. Oops.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to be, you know, this discussion, and in a way, I want to defer to those of you who knew Max personally, because I didn't. I knew Sandy a bit, but so, you know, there's the artist that you knew and saw, you know, over a drink and in a friendship over many years as a colleague and a friend and a mentor. And then, you know, my experience of Max is the public, it's the art first and foremost. Going to the library and finding an LP of Vesali Iacones. What is this? When you're a teenager, and who is this guy? And then hearing him on the radio, in interview, or reading. Nick has this wonderful collection of the selected writings, and I think it's fascinating to hear Alasdair. I think you just said, that to point out how strong he was, because if you look at sort of force of personality, if you look at the really early writings when he's going out there and just really attacking his dissatisfaction with the culture he finds himself in, and he's like 23. Who is this guy? And he's publishing this in William Glock's The Score. It's quite feisty, but it's forceful, but it's factual as well. It's not just someone blowing off steam. And so I mean, even if he hadn't written this incredible catalog of works that I just think is an absolute giant mountain range in British music. Even if he hadn't done that, he would be an important figure for his influence on teaching and his public advocacy and the Strathclyde as a public project. So there's all of that, and you've talked about the festival, and you see the photos of him, founding festivals and leading school children and writing these pieces, and it's an incredible. It's an incredible spirit and sort of force of personality that I mean, maybe one doesn't find that surprising in an artist, that you need that self-belief to do what you do, but the engagement with the public on his own terms, the Orkney perceived as a retreat from London or whatever, but it's a rather different sort of way of facing the public than Britain or I don't know, or Harry Birtwistle. Harry was always famously not very forthcoming. It's interesting to me that if you see these later interviews, there's a lovely interview that Tom Service did with Max and Harry, which I listened to recently in 2014. It's very moving because, the public story was, they may have fallen out in the 70s and they don't like each other anymore, and they're back together talking, and some of those things Max says things that you wouldn't expect him to say. So, he says, well, when we were at Darmstadt, I didn't like Darmstadt, which everyone sort of knows, and Goer had said the same thing, because they were dogmatic. And Max says, well, all these people, meaning the sort of German avant-garde of the 50s, including Karl-Heinz and all of those guys, he said, well, they were bad-mouthing Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, and he said that would be like betraying your parents. He says this to Tom Service in 2014. Now, that's a pretty striking comment, but it's also not something he was talking about publicly in the 50s and 60s when he was being branded as, this wild man with the megaphone. And but later on, he was starting to talk about his admiration for Vaughan Williams as a teenager, hearing all of the symphonies and the premieres, all of the latest symphonies, and how deeply the rhythmic language affected him. He didn't talk about this at the time, but he talked about it later. So I think there are layers of self-revelation there.
He did actually hear Sinfonia Antarctica as a 16-year-old, I think, and he in his diary he writes something quite he's intrigued by it. It's not like he rejected any of that. He was absorbing that as part of himself, and I think to a degree he went back to that when he went to his own Sinfonia Antarctica, but. It's interesting that the kind of layers that you find in Max, they come back not 1 year later, but 5 years, 10 years later. There's cycles of things come back. Nick.
My next question is very straightforward. We've had a number of Max's pieces and works cited today and referenced, but I'm really interested to know which of Max's works have made the biggest impact on you. So we will start with Robert, please.
Right. Well, I don't want to do the sort of classic FM Hall of Fame business or Desert Island Discs or but or Orkney Island Discs for that matter. I'm just thinking, I think it matters. The ones that are always there are the ones I first knew, which I think is the case with most of us. I think, isn't it? I think often something, even if you go off, it comes back later. But I remember being particularly stunned by Mirror of Whitening Light when I first heard it. I thought it was an extraordinary, vibrant piece. And also that, oh God, now I've gone and forgotten its name. The piece he wrote, the BBC Singers did quite large a cappella choral piece.
Martello.
Was it?
Red Hammer. No. Westerlings.
Westerlings. Yes, and there are certain things that stick out like beacons. I personally was never so keen on the theatre pieces, but that says more about me than it does about Max. The Fifth Symphony, I remember I had a postgraduate student who did some work on it, fascinatingly, and I learned a lot from that. It's very difficult. Crumbs, I'm being very awful now, because I'm stalling, and it's not because I don't want to say, it's because it is such a large output, and I'm just thinking intuitively of the pieces that strike me in that way. But I think there's something about the Second Taverner Fantasia. It's for me like Tippett's Midsummer Marriage or Peter Grimes for Britain. I just, it's a cornerstone for me.
Yeah, and Sally's father was very keen on that one too.
Oh, of course, yes. Of course.
I always quote him going to Max because they had to have relays of trumpet players because their lips just gave out. And father, in his very gentle way, going to Max and saying, there is a reason the fourth trumpet is the fourth trumpet, and Max had written these virtuoso parts for all of them. Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of the most truly terrifying experiences my father ever had.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing, as you mentioned the trumpet? I think this is just another little thing about Max. So the famous trumpet sonata, the opera. I was once on duty at York University for some examining, and a trumpeter came on. It's important, this. He was about 6'3", and about 25 bars into it, he just fainted. He went absolutely and hit his head on the floor, and the trumpet went skidding. Alan Hacker was in charge of this because, of course, he was on the staff at York. He wheeled himself on the river. I said, right, I think we'll take a break. And in fact, the chap was perfectly right. It turned out he was so nervous he hadn't had any breakfast or eaten the night before and all that. So I told Max about this, and it was terribly funny. Max said, "Oh, what fun." I thought it was a wonderful comment.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Phil, what about you? What's your reaction to this question?
Which of the works have made the biggest impact on you? Yes.
Yes.
I was trying to think of how to answer that. I mean, as a music historian, the nerd in the room, well, you are too, Nick, and Richard, the relationship here is, well, okay, which ones have I written about or studied, or, how does this fit into, some kind of historical argument? And that might seem like a weird angle. But the thing about when you write about a piece like Revelation and Fall, or I wrote about the first Tavern of Fantasia. It was a little frustrating. There wasn't a commercial recording for a long time, but I do think it's a fine piece. And it's sort of a cornerstone in its own way. And the second, of course, is the next part of that wall. You spend an awful lot of time with these pieces, much more than you do if you just go to the concert. You've got the score, you listen to them again and again. You really, if you're lucky, you look at the sketches. I mean, I did see the sketches for Revelation and Fall, and I know Joe Wilhelm, who's on the call today, has done this wonderful work on the World as Bliss sketches. So, and when you see the sketches, I mean, that's a magical moment. I mean, you fly over, if you're me, you fly over, you're jet lagged, you get into the reading room of the British Library if you're lucky, and it's not some problem. And you open the sketch page and you see, you're on the cliff face, you're sort of looking at someone climbing up the cliff, and you see the handwriting and you see the notes to self. And there are some, the first Fantasia, there's some nice little sort of prose comments about what he's going for. He's like, well, I want a sonata here. And Richard's written about this, the way he will narrate the parts of the piece. And I want the bells here. And, and there are little jottings in the side. He's got a bit of Beethoven Fifth jotted, da-da-da-da, is jotted in the side of the sketch. And you suddenly realize, okay, this is what's going on. Or if you look at the sketch of the Opus 2 pieces, the piano pieces, which I think are among the first that actually reached print, and he's very young and it's with shots. And he rewrites the pieces several times, changing not very much. No pitches are changed, but changing the articulation, changing, slurring, dynamics are shifting. And so, I mean, as a musicologist, you come to a weirdly intimate relationship with the art that way. And so there are some pieces, I mean, I'm not sure if I would say the Opus 2 piano pieces are that they would go onto the Orkney Island discs, along with the Bible and Shakespeare or whatever, but and the Liber Usualis. But having spent time with some of them, I mean, there's a kind of, going back to the idea of the power, there's a kind of ferocity about the way he writes for Ogden in this wild contrapuntal style and all over the keyboard. And I mean, it just has a power about it. Then there are, the other side of the argument is the pieces that you first came to know. So in my case, I think I did sing in a church choir, but I didn't grow up, we didn't sing any Maxwell Davies, unfortunately. But I remember, when I was about 13, finding this LP. I was going to bring it in today, but I forgot. It's too early over here. LP, New Music from London. It's on Mainstream Records. Earl Brown was doing it. And it has Antichrist on it. It's a 5-minute piece. I think that was the first piece of Max's I ever heard on record. And I just kind of put the thing on and like, okay, who is this Maxwell Davies figure? And, it starts with this running through of this 13th century motet instrument, arranged incredibly beautifully. And then it goes wild. The Fires of London then start doing their stuff. I mean, you just sort of jump out of your chair the first time you hear that when you're 13 years old, and you never forget it. So, I mean, a piece like Antichrist, that would probably go to the desert island for me. And some of the other pieces I've, spent time with over the years, I mean, something like Leopardi Fragments that, when someone was mentioning the idea of the sort of cathedral, I don't know, the intensity of every single note with this composer. Having spent a lot of time listening to and writing a little bit about Leopardi Fragments, it's just, there's a real subtle intensity about, I mean, I can see that piece as a response to Le Marteau sans Maître, as a response to Sandiger's The Deluge. It's a sort of early 60s chamber cantata. Absolutely. But it's also Max, having spent time in Italy and his deep connection to Leopardi's poetry and the images in that. It's an early piece for him, but it's an incredibly artistically mature piece and elegant and beautifully recorded. You know, the early recording really does it justice. So, yeah, I mean, we could go on for a long time. Those aren't the only ones, but those are some of the. Yeah.
And now it's the Strathclyde and the Naxos.
Yeah. Well, there's only 20 of them, Nick.
Oh, of course, yeah, only. Alasdair, what about you?
Well, I suppose I hinted earlier on that I'd written a dissertation on the music theatre work, so I think they would sit as sort of important memories within a range of pieces that I think of. And funnily enough, one I programmed here and forced the fantastically talented Lottie Betts-Dean to perform for me at the festival was The Medium, a monodrama written for, again, the extraordinary, and there are other words one can use for Mary Thomas. I mean, she was just a really extraordinary performer and person. And Max wrote the words for that. He created this 50-odd minutes of solo voice, sort of mad scene. It could be any manner of things, actually. It's very complex psychologically, talking of masks and everything, really complex in terms of what it's about, really complex in musical terms, but a real sort of virtuoso showpiece for the composer as well as the performer. So, homing in on that sort of world, I would say, the music theatre piece is very important to me. Then I would probably home in on two companion pieces, which are the kind of things that just make me stop and feel very still, which are Image, Reflection, Shadow, and Ave Maristella.
Oh, yeah.
The two, one, I think you got it the wrong way around earlier, Robert, but Image, Reflection is Cimbalum, Cymbalum, and...
I'm sorry.
And Ave Maristella is marimba. So it's...
I'll say 3 Hail Marys, sorry.
Make sure you do.
Yeah.
Because he'll be watching if he's upstairs, downstairs. I'm not quite sure where.
I'm sorry.
But those are the epitome of sort of Fires orchestration, but are so concentrated and so well thought through for the instruments, for the architecture, for the progression through. For me, those are two really special pieces, and we've done them in the cathedral here in Orkney, and boy, do they ring for that building. They become more special, if you like, here. So I would say that as sort of deep listening, those pieces bring me everything I want from sort of Max's world. They have some extraordinary moments of outward speaking, but they are intensely personal and very introvert in many ways as well, and allow players to be the same, which they're a gift to performers because they allow to show technical virtuosity, but they also allow to express kind of thought and emotion and everything else. So those are my two pieces. And I suppose beyond that, I mean, there are so many. I knowing all of Max's work means that you could home in on so many for the desert island. But I probably would go for another part of Max, another bit of personality, which is, and he will hate me for this, which is Farewell to Strumness. Now, I mentioned that, it's become a bit of a cliche, etc. But, to be able to do something like that and for it to tap into something, and let me tell you that locally, in a world where there are internationally performing folk musicians, etc., that piece of music is a bit of a local anthem. It's not just something on Classic FM that's got a bit of currency. It's really beloved here. And I remember at Max's funeral at the Grave, where Fionn MacArthur played it on solo violin. It was sort of extraordinary. And I think within the same thought, I would mention the music for The Boyfriend. And I suppose I'm going into those pieces because that's another aspect of Max which I admired enormously, his ability to swivel into very expert other kinds of music from perhaps what you might regard as, his main currency, if you like. He could write a very beautiful birthday piece for bassoon and violin the night before it was somebody's birthday. He could write something like Farewell to Stromness and could go and transform the orchestration of Sandy Wilson's daft West End musical into something phantasmagorical, because he had a sort of expert technique, ultimately, which the sort of Farewell to Stromness and other pieces, Mavis in Las Vegas, etc., that ability, if he wanted to, as I say, swivel towards just showing pure ability to hear, to have technique, to create, to recreate, to parody, to whatever. I think as somebody that's worked a lot in the theatre and appreciates that, I think, that shows a formidable talent, actually.
Can I just add, I should have mentioned that because RMR is stellar. And also another side to Max, if I could just add this, I got to know the 7 in Nomine when I put them on as a student and conducted them. And there in microcosm is Max's genius. And I think it is a sort of genius at particularly the movement, which is sort of slightly out of tune chamber organ and his takes on the pieces is extraordinary.
I'd forgotten about that piece, and I need to go back and listen to that, and I've got the score over there, so thanks for reminding me of that one. Now we have got around about 7 minutes left. I'm just wondering, Richard, whether we ought to jump to the last question. I think that would be
I think that's
a good idea, wouldn't it? Yeah,
I think so. We've talked a lot about Max and working with him, but it's quite obvious from various things, letters that he wrote and put in the diaries and so on, that he experienced a compositional crisis, which is roughly every 10 years. Starting in 1959, and then there's 69 was World's Bliss, and then 79 he wrote to John Amos saying he was having a trip. This is while he was writing Lighthouse. The 69 one was the most obvious one. It was because of that, what was he perceived as a disastrous premiere, and then then the Lighthouse and Salome. The interesting thing about Salome was that he left it till quite late to write that for whatever reason, and he had to kind of abandon himself to his invention. And I wondered whether that tension that was created because he'd started working with Magic Squares, and then suddenly he had to do something very quickly. He'd think it through in his brain and then just write. That might have contributed somewhat to the idea that there was a problem for him at that point. What do you? I know you probably were aware of some of these things where his self feeling was perhaps turning negative. What do you think he was affected by these compositional crises? And how did, if you know anything, how do you think he recovered from them? Alasdair, perhaps we'll start with you.
Fine. I'm sort of probably less aware of the compositional crisis than, to be honest with you. Reading that question, I'm sort of intrigued.
Same here.
Because I can remember being on a panel with Max talking about composition, etc. And I don't know what question was asked, something to do with how we all did it. And I was expounding on the idea that, sometimes it was a difficult day with the white page and the blank space, etc. You would think of anything else that you could do other than write music and etc. Just giving the conventional sort of answer of it's sometimes quite hard. and sometimes you struggle. And Max cut right across me, I remember, saying, "Oh, I have more ideas than I know what to do with. I, never have a problem writing a piece and starting." So I honestly never talked to Max or encountered the idea of crisis or struggle. Maybe was never revealed to me as a younger composer. I don't know, but it was sort of almost revelatory to read your question.
Robert, you're saying you didn't. Well, looked as though you were saying you hadn't come across that in him either.
No, the only thing I know, and this is hearsay, and therefore I'm really careful about this, but I was told by somebody who was in one of the classes, I wasn't there or assisting Max or anything, that he had got very upset, not cross, but upset because he thought that the class didn't like his work or weren't interested. What I mean. It's and they felt that he was deeply hurt that wasn't there at me. Whether that's true, I never saw that side of Max, so I can't say.
I can sort of reflect that slightly, because I remember here with our composers course, which happened at the same time in the festival, and there was a performance of Magnus, Martyrdom of Magnus going on, and the students they had the option to go to everything, but they chose some of them not to. And yes, Max was very exercised by the idea that they had a chance to hear his work and him being around to talk about it, etc. And indeed, more broadly, the fact that they weren't taking every damn opportunity to go and listen and hear and see live performance.
But they don't. Students don't.
No, quite. But I remember Max being sort of, as was I, sort of horrified, given that we were giving free tickets and everything, Yes,
absolutely.
But he got quite upset, actually, literally, about that.
That's what I must have been. Yeah, thank you, Alasdair.
Yeah.
But does anybody else? Then we have. I'm conscious that we've not heard from others. Does anybody want to make any further comments? Yes, go, Alasdair.
Sorry, I don't want to use the time up, but just my own Labyrinth delight moment with Max was in 2002. We invited him to be patron of the Classic Fair Isle Festival, which is a festival we held on Fair Isle, the small island between Orkney and Shetland. And Max graciously, graciously came for the week and was next. I was directing members of Chroma from London, 4 of the wonderful musicians from that group. And I remember we're getting bogged down in one of the rehearsals. It was probably the brass, the horn player that was the issue. I don't remember. But Max, I said, "Look, Max, what can I do to kind of get unbogged from this?" And he kind of took some time, and he just said, "Why don't we just all go for a walk?" And so it was later in the day, in the afternoon, and we walked up. I took the 4 musicians and Max and I. We walked up to the top of Ward Hill, which is the tallest hill in Fair Isle, and we just looked west and we saw the most magnificent sunset. And I realized, the next day things really did sort themselves out with no problems at all. And it was my own kind of inability just to get that rehearsal together. But Max realized that, and he did definitely what was best, and things returned to normal. And it was a wonderful week. And actually, he went on and wrote that piano trio, A Voyage to Fair Isle, based on that week experience. But a generous and fantastic opportunity to spend with Max that week. So, thanks.
Oh, lovely. Nick, back to you.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Alasdair.
Lovely.
Phil, did you want to just add something? I just sensed that you wanted to say something there.
Well, I know we're short on time, but I mean, the crisis question, I think other people have already said. I mean, they weren't aware, and I wasn't either. Which doesn't mean I don't believe it was a real thing, but I also think, sort of thinking historically, that there was never a blockage. There's 6 decades, hundreds of pieces. It's like with Elliott Carter. It sort of accelerates, and you get more and more, and maybe with the other Manchester figures as well. There's a kind of flow. It's not like Schoenberg not writing a piece for 10 years during the World War II, and there's a 10-year silence, more or less. He can't finish the Jakobsleiter, and or Sibelius not writing anything for the last 25 years. So I think we'd have to sort of define what we mean by crisis. Crisis is a big word, it didn't seem to stop him, is the obvious point. The other point is chronology, because we know that he started a libretto for Tavener in the mid-50s while he was still a student, but the opera isn't finished till the late 60s and then done in 72, I think. And so, you get this sort of sense of what the chronology is. But it's like Bertrand La Masque of Orpheus. He'd been working on that for 10 or 15 years, as a project. It started out as a Faust project, ends up being the Masque of Orpheus. So you get different moments in the career where something becomes public. I'm glad that Alasdair mentioned the music, things like the music for the boyfriend, because I think that the foxtrots, which get a lot of that gets a lot of airplay in sort of the public image of Max. But I think those things were very meaningful for him. The Ninth Quartet, which we heard the opening of, is one of those pieces where he's reflecting on his memory of World War II bombing, which anyone who grew up in England, including my mother, my late mother, this is a national memory. People lived through this. The neighbors were bombed out. He talks about this, and the exaggerated vibrato and the glissandi and this is the sound of bombs for him. But at the same time, it's complicated because the foxtrots they're listening to on the gramophone are 20s music. It's his parents' music. He's remembering it as a kid. Sandy Wilson writes a daft show in the 50s. Max reorchestrates it 20 years later. There's these layers of history in that piece, that just as there are with the In Nomine pieces. So, there's always going to be this incredible depth and intensity. I'm glad the Ave Maris Stella and the image reflection shadow piece I mentioned, because I'll tell you from an American perspective, the Americans really dig those pieces. The Fires toured to New York, and those pieces were among the first that were recorded on the major label. And when I talk to Steve Jaffe or Scott Lindrath, my colleagues here at Duke, very fine composers, they remember those pieces. They immediately start talking about things like that. So it's interesting to see the international reach of that.
Peter has his hand in the air.
I was just going to say, Richard, in terms of these crises, in a way, I remember an early conference that I think you and I would have been present at. I think, was it Lancaster?
Yes, I organised that.
Yes, you thought you did a long time ago, and Max was there, and he was anticipating it from a very early stage. He was talking about how concerned he was, in his time studying with Petrassi and so forth, to build a technique that whatever situation he might have to face as his working life progressed, that he could always return to that. He had a very solid compositional technique. So if you think about, the World is Bliss situation coming straight after the set of theatre pieces and so forth, then he can go straight back to exactly that technique, which as David Roberts characterizes as a toolbox, in terms of how he would just be able to take a piece of material as if it were a piece of driftwood or something like that, and have a set of tools and know exactly how to get something going again. So that the idea of getting something from an early age that he knew would carry him through, I think, was important.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. I think, we've gone past our time. I think we better wrap up for today. I just want to thank everyone for your attendance today and for your concentration as well. And a particular thank you to our three speakers, Robert Saxton, Phil Rupprecht, and Alasdair Nicolson. And Richard and I are deeply grateful for your contributions. So thank you so much for that. It's been a wonderful, fascinating afternoon. Phil, thank you for and of course, Alasdair, tuning in from the States. I'm not sure what time it is over there at the minute, but it was very early for an early start for you. So you can go to bed now. Thank you. So thanks again, and I wish you all the very best, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Nicholas, can I just thank you on behalf of our speakers, you and Richard? That's fantastic to be asked, and wish everyone a very happy Christmas, slightly in advance.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Okay. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.